The fertile alluvial plains stretching between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers witnessed humanity's first deliberate transformation from scattered agricultural villages into complex urban centres during the 4th millennium BC. This transformation marked the beginning of what archaeologists recognise as the Uruk period, a revolutionary phase that emerged from the preceding Ubaid cultural horizon and fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization. The Ubaid period, spanning roughly from 6,500 to 3,800 BC, had established the foundational elements that would enable the subsequent urban revolution. Ubaid communities had already mastered irrigation techniques on a modest scale, developed sophisticated pottery traditions, and created the first temple complexes that would serve as prototypes for later Sumerian religious architecture. However, these settlements remained relatively small, typically housing no more than a few hundred inhabitants organised around extended family groups and simple agricultural practices. The transition to what scholars term the Uruk period represented a quantum leap in social organisation and technological capability. Archaeological evidence from key sites demonstrates that this transformation occurred gradually over several centuries, with communities steadily expanding in size, complexity and influence. The process involved not merely population growth, but fundamental changes in how societies organised labour, managed resources and structured political authority. Eridu stands as perhaps the most significant example of this evolutionary process. Located in what is now southern Iraq, Eridu holds the distinction of being considered by later Mesopotamian traditions as the first city ever established. Archaeological excavations have revealed a continuous sequence of temple construction spanning over a millennium, with each successive structure built directly atop its predecessor. The earliest temples, dating to approximately 5000 BC, were modest mud brick structures with simple rectangular plans. By 4000 BC, these had evolved into elaborate complexes featuring raised platforms, multiple chambers, and sophisticated architectural details that would become hallmarks of Mesopotamian religious architecture. The temple sequence at Eridu reveals crucial insights into the emergence of organised religion as a driving force behind urbanisation. Each reconstruction phase demonstrates increasing architectural sophistication and expanded capacity, suggesting growing congregations and more elaborate ritual practices. The temples were not merely places of worship, but served as economic centres controlling agricultural surplus, craft production, and trade networks. This concentration of religious and economic functions created the institutional framework necessary for supporting larger populations and more complex social hierarchies. Another pivotal site in understanding early Sumerian development, provides complementary evidence for the urbanisation process. The earliest levels at date to approximately 4000 BC and reveal a settlement pattern markedly different from earlier Ubaid villages. Instead of scattered individual compounds, displays evidence of planned urban layout with distinct residential quarters, craft production areas, and ceremonial precincts. The famous royal cemetery of though dating to a later period, sits atop earlier settlement layers that demonstrate continuous occupation and gradual expansion throughout the late 4th millennium BC. Archaeological investigations at have uncovered extensive evidence of specialised craft production during the early Uruk period. Workshops dedicated to pottery manufacture, metalworking, textile production and stone carving indicate a level of economic specialisation impossible in smaller agricultural communities. The quality and standardisation of artefacts from these workshops suggest the emergence of full-time craftsmen whose skills were supported by agricultural surplus managed through centralised institutions. Uruk itself, the type site for this period, represents the culmination of early Mesopotamian urban development. By 3500 BC, Uruk had grown to encompass over 250 hectares, making it by far the largest settlement in the world at that time. The site's massive scale required unprecedented levels of social organisation and resource management. the famous White Temple complex, constructed atop a towering ziggurat platform, dominated the urban landscape and served as both a religious centre and administrative headquarters for the surrounding region. The architectural achievements at Uruk demonstrate sophisticated engineering capabilities that required coordinated labour forces numbering in the thousands. The construction of monumental platforms, elaborate drainage systems, and massive defensive walls involved quarrying, transporting, and precisely placing millions of mud bricks. Such projects necessitated not only technical expertise, but also administrative systems capable of organising, feeding, and directing large workforces over extended periods. The development of irrigation agriculture provided the economic foundation that made these urban centres possible. The alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia offered exceptional agricultural potential, but realising this potential required extensive modification of the natural landscape. The annual flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates deposited rich sediments across the region, creating extraordinarily fertile soils. However, the timing and intensity of these floods often proved unsuitable for agricultural needs, requiring human intervention to channel and control water flow. Early Sumerian communities developed increasingly sophisticated irrigation networks that transformed the natural flood regime into a reliable agricultural system. These networks began as simple diversions channeling water from natural watercourses into adjacent fields. Over time, they evolved into complex systems featuring primary canals, secondary distribution channels, and intricate drainage networks that could irrigate vast areas while preventing waterlogging and salt accumulation. The construction and maintenance of these irrigation systems required unprecedented levels of cooperation among multiple communities. Unlike rain-fed agriculture, which could be practiced by individual families or small groups, irrigation agriculture demanded coordinated effort across entire watersheds. Communities had to negotiate water rights, coordinate construction projects, maintain canal systems, and resolve disputes over water allocation. These necessities created the first inter-community political institutions and established precedents for the territorial states that would later characterize Sumerian civilization. The agricultural abundance produced by irrigation systems supported population densities far exceeding those possible under earlier subsistence strategies. Archaeological evidence suggests that the population of southern Mesopotamia increased dramatically during the Uruk period, with some estimates indicating a tenfold increase in total population between 4000 and 3000 BC. This population growth concentrated in urban centres rather than spreading evenly across the landscape, creating the demographic conditions necessary for social stratification and occupational specialisation. The emergence of social stratification becomes clearly visible in the archaeological record during this period. Earlier Ubaid settlements show relatively little evidence of significant wealth differences among inhabitants. Houses were generally similar in size and construction, and grave goods displayed minimal variation in quantity or quality. The Uruk period presents a dramatically different picture, with clear evidence of emerging social hierarchies reflected in residential architecture, burial practices, and material culture. Elite residences from Uruk period sites feature substantially larger floor plans, higher quality construction materials, and more sophisticated architectural details than ordinary dwellings. These structures often included private courtyards, multiple stories, and specialised rooms for storage or craft activities. The concentration of luxury goods within these residences indicates that their inhabitants controlled disproportionate shares of community wealth and had access to exotic materials obtained through long-distance trade networks. The development of specialised crafts accelerated dramatically during the Uruk period, driven by both technological innovation and increasing social differentiation. Pottery production evolved from a household activity to a specialised craft practiced by dedicated artisans. The invention of the potter's wheel during this period enabled the mass production of standardised ceramic vessels, while new firing techniques allowed for more durable and aesthetically sophisticated products. Metalworking also underwent significant advancement during the early Uruk period. While copper had been used sporadically during the Ubaid period, the 4th millennium BC witnessed the development of systematic metal production and the first experiments with bronze alloys. Archaeological evidence from Uruk period sites includes sophisticated copper and bronze tools, weapons, and ornamental objects that required considerable technical expertise to produce. Textile production emerged as another major specialised craft during this period. The introduction of the horizontal loom enabled the production of larger and more complex fabrics than had been possible with earlier weaving techniques. Evidence from sites like Uruk and Ur suggests that textile production became a major economic activity, with some workshops apparently producing fabrics for export to distant regions. The expansion of trade networks during the Uruk period connected southern Mesopotamian communities with resource zones throughout the broader region. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that Uruk period sites imported obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from the Zagros Mountains, and metals from various highland regions. These trade relationships required sophisticated logistical capabilities and established the commercial networks that would later facilitate the spread of Sumerian cultural influence throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. Religious institutions played a central role in organising and legitimising the social transformations of the Uruk period. The temple complexes that dominated urban centres served multiple functions beyond their obvious religious purposes. They acted as economic centres controlling agricultural surplus, craft production, and trade activities. They provided venues for community gatherings and decision-making processes. They served as repositories for technical knowledge and administrative expertise. The priests who administered these institutions emerged as the first recognisable ruling class in human history. Unlike earlier community leaders whose authority derived primarily from personal charisma or kinship relationships, Uruk period priests claimed legitimacy through their special relationship with divine powers. This religious foundation for political authority provided a more stable and transferable basis for leadership than had existed in earlier societies. The administrative innovations that emerged during the late Uruk period provided the foundation for the dramatic political and architectural developments that characterized the early dynastic period. 1. As the 3rd millennium BC commenced, the proto-writing systems developed for temple record-keeping evolved into the world's first true writing system, fundamentally transforming how Sumerian societies preserved knowledge, conducted administration, and conceptualized their relationship with both the divine and temporal realms. The transformation of pictographic tokens into cuneiform script represents one of humanity's most significant intellectual achievements. The earliest cuneiform tablets from sites like Uruk and Jemdet Nasser demonstrate the systematic evolution from simple pictographic representations to complex syllabic writing capable of expressing abstract concepts, grammatical relationships, and nuanced meanings. Scribes initially employed pictographic symbols to represent concrete objects and quantities, pressing these symbols into soft clay using reed styluses. The physical properties of clay and the practical requirements of rapid writing gradually transformed these pictographic symbols into the distinctive wedge-shaped marks that define cuneiform script. Archaeological evidence from Uruk reveals that scribal schools operated within major temple complexes by approximately 2900 BC, indicating the institutionalization of literacy training and the emergence of a professional scribal class. These schools produced thousands of practice tablets demonstrating the systematic curriculum used to train scribes in increasingly complex writing techniques. Students began with simple sign lists and numerical exercises before progressing to administrative documents, legal contracts, and eventually literary compositions. The development of syllabic writing enabled scribes to record the Sumerian language with unprecedented precision and flexibility. Unlike purely pictographic systems, cuneiform could represent grammatical particles, verb tenses, and abstract concepts that had no direct visual reference. This capability proved essential for recording legal decisions, religious rituals, and administrative procedures with the accuracy required for effective governance of increasingly complex urban societies. The expansion of cuneiform literacy beyond temple precincts marked a crucial development in Sumerian political organisation. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites indicates that by 2800 BC, cuneiform writing was being employed for secular administrative purposes, commercial transactions, and legal proceedings conducted outside direct temple control. This expansion of literacy created new possibilities for political organisation and social coordination that would fundamentally reshape Sumerian civilization. The architectural achievements of early dynastic period reflected both the increased organisational capabilities enabled by writing systems and the growing political ambitions of Sumerian rulers. The construction of the first true ziggurats during this period represented a quantum leap in architectural scale and engineering sophistication that dwarfed even the impressive temple platforms of the preceding Uruk period. The ziggurat at Eridu, constructed during the early centuries of the 3rd millennium BC, established the architectural template that would influence Mesopotamian religious architecture for over 2 millennia. Rising approximately 40 metres above the surrounding plain, this massive step pyramid consisted of multiple terraced levels constructed from millions of carefully manufactured mud bricks. Each level featured distinct architectural elements including buttressed walls, elaborate drainage systems, and precisely calculated proportional relationships that demonstrated advanced mathematical and engineering knowledge. Archaeological investigation of the Eridu ziggurat reveals the sophisticated construction techniques employed by early dynastic builders. The structure's foundation incorporated complex drainage systems designed to prevent water damage to the mud brick superstructure. Multiple types of bricks were employed for different structural functions, with specially designed interlocking systems providing stability for the massive walls. The outer surfaces featured elaborate decorative elements, including mosaic patterns created from coloured stone and shell inlays. The construction of such massive structures required unprecedented levels of social organisation and resource mobilisation. Conservative estimates suggest that the Eridu ziggurat required over 10 million individual bricks, representing approximately 50,000 person-days of labour for brick production alone. Additional labour was required for quarrying and transporting raw materials, site preparation, construction supervision, and architectural decoration. The coordination of such massive construction projects necessitated administrative systems capable of organising, provisioning, and directing labour forces, numbering in the thousands over periods spanning multiple years. Similar architectural achievements occurred simultaneously at other major Sumerian centres. The White Temple complex at Uruk underwent massive expansion during early dynastic period 1, with new construction phases adding elaborate courtyards, subsidiary temples, and administrative buildings that transformed the site into a sprawling religious and governmental complex covering over 50 hectares. The scale and sophistication of this expansion reflected Uruk's growing political importance and the increasing resources controlled by its ruling institutions. The temple complex at Nippur, which would later become the religious centre of Sumerian civilization, experienced its first major construction phase during this period. Archaeological evidence indicates that the Ekur temple, dedicated to the god Enlil, was established as a massive ziggurat complex during the early centuries of the 3rd millennium BC. The positioning of Nippur at the geographical centre of Sumer, combined with the religious significance attributed to Enlil as king of the gods, made this temple complex a crucial focal point for intercity political and religious relationships. The emergence of distinct city-states with defined territorial boundaries represents perhaps the most significant political development of early dynastic period 1. Unlike the earlier urban centres of the Uruk period, which exercised influence over surrounding regions through religious and economic networks, The city-states of the early dynastic period established formal territorial control over specific geographical areas with clearly demarcated boundaries. Uruk emerged as the largest and most influential of these early city-states, controlling a territory extending over 1,000 square kilometres in the central Euphrates region. Archaeological surveys have identified numerous smaller settlements within this territory that were clearly subordinate to Uruk, providing agricultural surplus, craft products, and military service in exchange for protection and access to trade networks. The relationship between Uruk and its satellite communities established patterns of territorial organisation that would characterise Mesopotamian political systems for centuries. The city-state of developed simultaneously in the southeastern region of Sumer, establishing control over the economically crucial marshlands where the Euphrates approached the Persian Gulf. Ur's strategic location provided access to maritime trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Arabian Peninsula and the Indus Valley civilization. Archaeological evidence from early dynastic levels at reveals extensive harbour facilities, specialised workshops for processing imported materials, and residential quarters housing foreign merchants and craftsmen. Lagash emerged as a major power in the eastern regions of Sumer, controlling territory along the Tigris River and its major tributaries. The city-state's location provided access to highland trade routes and agricultural resources that complemented those available to the Euphrates-based city-states. Archaeological investigations at Lagash have revealed extensive irrigation systems dating to early dynastic period Buffoon that enabled intensive agricultural production across thousands of hectares of previously marginal land. The territorial boundaries between these city-states were established through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic negotiation, and religious sanction. Archaeological evidence indicates that major boundary markers were erected at crucial geographical points, often taking the form of elaborate stelae inscribed with cuneiform texts describing territorial agreements and divine sanctions for boundary violations. These markers represent some of the earliest examples of international law and diplomatic protocol in human history. The establishment of territorial city-states necessitated new forms of political organisation that transcended the temple-based authority structures of earlier periods. While religious institutions continued to play crucial roles in legitimising political authority, the practical requirements of territorial administration created opportunities for secular leaders to assume positions of significant power and influence. The emergence of kingship during early dynastic period marked a fundamental transformation in Sumerian political organisation. Unlike the priest-rulers of earlier periods, whose authority derived primarily from their religious functions, the new kings claimed legitimacy through their military prowess, administrative capabilities, and divine appointment to secular leadership roles. This development created dual power structures in many city-states, with religious and secular authorities sharing control over different aspects of governance. Archaeological evidence for early kingship appears in the form of elaborate royal burials, monumental palace complexes, and inscribed monuments celebrating royal achievements. The royal cemetery at while dating to a slightly later period, provides insight into the development of royal ideology during early dynastic period 1. The massive scale of these burials, involving the sacrifice of dozens of retainers and the interment of extraordinary quantities of luxury goods, demonstrates the emergence of concepts of divine kingship that would influence Mesopotamian political thought for millennia. The legendary figure of Gilgamesh of Uruk represents the archetypal early dynastic king, embodying the military, administrative, and religious functions that defined royal authority during this period. While the historical existence of Gilgamesh remains debated among scholars, the literary traditions surrounding this figure provide valuable insights into early dynastic concepts of kingship and political legitimacy. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though composed in later periods, preserves memories of early dynastic political relationships, military campaigns, and royal responsibilities that illuminate the practical realities of early kingship. Contemporary cuneiform sources from early dynastic period. or provide additional evidence for the emergence of royal authority. Administrative tablets from multiple sites record royal land grants, judicial decisions, and military commands that demonstrate the practical exercise of kingly power. These documents reveal that early dynastic kings controlled significant economic resources, maintained professional military forces, and exercised judicial authority over both urban and rural populations within their territories. The military aspects of early dynastic kingship reflected the increasingly competitive relationships among Sumerian city-states. Archaeological evidence indicates that fortification systems became standard features of major urban centres during this period, with massive defensive walls protecting city cores and elaborate gate complexes controlling access to urban areas. The construction of these fortifications required substantial investment in both materials and labour, reflecting the serious military threats faced by early dynastic city-states. Military technology underwent significant advancement during early dynastic period 1, driven by the practical requirements of territorial warfare and siege operations. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites reveals the development of new weapon types, including composite bows, bronze-tipped spears, and sophisticated battle axes designed specifically for combat against armoured opponents. The standardization of weapon production and the emergence of specialized military equipment indicate the professionalization of warfare during this period. The famous standard of though dating to early dynastic period 2, provides visual evidence for the military organization that emerged during the preceding period. The artifact's detailed depictions of Sumerian military formations, equipment, and tactics demonstrate the sophisticated military systems that enabled early dynastic city-states to maintain territorial control and conduct successful campaigns against neighbouring powers. The economic foundation supporting these political and military developments underwent significant transformation during early dynastic period 1. The expansion of irrigation agriculture continued the trends established during the Uruk period, but the scale and sophistication of hydraulic engineering reached unprecedented levels. Major canal systems constructed during this period irrigated tens of thousands of hectares and supported population densities approaching those of modern, intensive agricultural regions. The sophisticated administrative systems developed for managing irrigation networks provided the institutional framework that would enable the intense military competition characterizing the subsequent centuries. As the early dynastic period progressed into its second and third phases, the territorial city-states established during the preceding period began engaging in increasingly aggressive campaigns to expand their boundaries, secure crucial water resources, and control profitable trade routes. This era of sustained interstate warfare fundamentally transformed Sumerian political organization, military technology, and cultural expression. The competition for water rights emerged as the primary catalyst for military conflict between Sumerian city-states. The complex irrigation systems that supported agricultural prosperity required continuous maintenance, periodic expansion, and careful coordination among multiple political entities sharing common watersheds. Disputes arose when upstream city-states constructed new canals that reduced water flow to downstream communities, when seasonal flooding damaged canal infrastructure requiring expensive repairs, or when population growth necessitated expansion of irrigated territories into contested border regions. The conflict between Lagash and Umma exemplifies the intensity and persistence of these water-based territorial disputes. Located in adjacent territories along the eastern edge of Sumer, these city-states shared access to several major canal systems that drew water from Tigris tributaries flowing from the Zagros Mountains. Archaeological evidence indicates that both city-states invested heavily in canal construction and agricultural development throughout the early 3rd millennium BC, creating overlapping claims to water resources and irrigated land that generated persistent tensions. The earliest documented phase of the Lagash-Umma conflict appears in cuneiform inscriptions dating to approximately 2650 BC, describing boundary disputes over a fertile agricultural region known as the Gu Edina. This territory, strategically positioned between the two city-states, contained some of the most productive irrigated land in eastern Sumer and controlled access to several major trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with highland regions. Both city-states claimed historical rights to the territory based on ancient religious traditions and previous military conquests. Eonatum of Lagash emerged as the most successful military commander of this extended conflict, conducting a series of campaigns during the mid-27th century BC that temporarily secured Lagash's dominance over the disputed territories. Contemporary inscriptions describe Eonatum's military achievements in considerable detail, providing valuable insights into early dynastic warfare tactics, equipment, and political objectives. The famous Stele of the Vultures, commissioned to commemorate Eonatum's victories, depicts Sumerian military formations employing coordinated infantry tactics that represented significant advances over earlier combat methods. The Stele's detailed battle scenes reveal that Eonatum's forces employed tight phalanx formations consisting of heavily armed infantry soldiers carrying large rectangular shields and long bronze-tipped spears. These formations advanced in coordinated ranks, with frontline soldiers protecting themselves and their comrades through overlapping shield coverage, while rear ranks provided spear support over the shoulders of forward troops. The tactical sophistication displayed in these depictions demonstrates the professionalization of Sumerian military forces and the development of systematic combat training programs. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites associated with the Lagash-Umma conflict provides additional details about early dynastic military equipment and tactics. Excavations of recovered bronze spearheads, battle axes, and mace heads, displaying standardized manufacturing techniques that indicate centralized weapons production. The quality and uniformity of these weapons suggest that major city-states maintained specialized armories staffed by skilled craftsmen capable of producing military equipment in substantial quantities. The development of bronze metallurgy during this period enabled significant improvements in weapon effectiveness and durability. Bronze weapons offered substantial advantages over earlier copper implements, providing harder cutting edges, more durable points, and greater resistance to battle damage. Archaeological analysis of recovered weapons indicates that Sumerian metalworkers had mastered sophisticated alloying techniques, producing bronze compositions optimized for specific military applications. The introduction of the war chariot represented perhaps the most significant military innovation of the early dynastic period 2 and 3. Archaeological evidence from royal burials at Ur and other major sites demonstrates that Sumerian forces had developed effective chariot warfare by approximately 2600 BC. These early war chariots differed substantially from the later horse-drawn vehicles employed by subsequent civilizations, utilizing teams of onagers or mules to pull heavy four-wheeled vehicles carrying crews of 2 or 3 warriors. The Standard of Ur provides detailed visual evidence for early dynastic chariot design and tactical employment. The artifact's war panel depicts multiple chariots, advancing in coordinated formations, with crews armed with spears and battle axes engaging enemy infantry forces. The chariots themselves feature solid wooden wheels, elaborate decorative elements, and harness systems designed to control teams of 4 onagers. The tactical scenes suggest that chariots were employed primarily as mobile platforms for elite warriors, rather than as shock weapons designed to break enemy formations through direct impact. The logistical requirements for maintaining chariot forces necessitated significant economic investment and administrative sophistication. Training and maintaining teams of onagers required specialized knowledge and substantial resources, as these animals proved more difficult to manage than domesticated horses. The construction of war chariots demanded skilled woodworkers, metal workers, and leather craftsmen capable of producing complex mechanical systems. The coordination of chariot forces in battle required extensive training and communication systems that represented major advances in military organization. Contemporary cuneiform sources provide additional evidence for the scale and intensity of early dynastic warfare. Administrative tablets from multiple city-states record military expenditures, troop mobilizations, and casualty reports that demonstrate the substantial resources devoted to military activities during this period. These documents reveal that major city-states maintained standing armies numbering in the thousands, supported by extensive logistical systems capable of sustaining prolonged military campaigns. The Sumerian king list, compiled during later periods but preserving memories of early dynastic rulers, provides a chronological framework for understanding the succession of military conflicts that characterized this era. While the document's early entries contain legendary elements that limit their historical reliability, the list preserves valuable information about the relative power and territorial extent of different city-states during specific periods. According to the king list, the city-state of Kish achieved temporary hegemony over much of northern Sumer during the early 27th century BC under rulers whose military achievements earned them recognition throughout the region. Archaeological evidence from Kish supports this tradition, revealing massive fortification systems and palace complexes that indicate substantial political and military power during the relevant period. The rise of Uruk as a dominant military power during the later early dynastic period reflects the city-state's successful adaptation to the changing requirements of interstate warfare. Under rulers traditionally associated with the Gilgamesh dynasty, Uruk conducted successful military campaigns that extended its territorial control throughout central and southern Sumer. Archaeological evidence from sites within Uruk's expanded territory reveals the construction of fortified outposts, administrative centres, and military installations that enabled effective control over conquered regions. The military conflicts of this period drove innovations in fortification architecture that transformed the defensive capabilities of Sumerian city-states. The massive walls constructed around major urban centres during early dynastic period 2 and 3 represented substantial improvements over earlier defensive systems, incorporating sophisticated engineering features designed to resist siege warfare and coordinated assault tactics. Archaeological investigation of the defensive walls at Uruk reveals the advanced engineering techniques employed by early dynastic military architects. The city's fortification system consisted of multiple defensive lines, including outer earthworks, intermediate walls, and inner citadel fortifications that created overlapping defensive zones. The main wall system featured massive mud brick construction, reinforced with bitumen, waterproofing, and incorporating defensive towers positioned at regular intervals to provide flanking fire against attacking forces. The gates controlling access to fortified cities represented particularly sophisticated examples of defensive architecture. The famous Ishtar Gate at Babylon, though dating to a later period, exemplifies the architectural traditions established during the early dynastic period. These gate complexes featured multiple chambers, indirect approaches designed to channel attacking forces into killing zones, and elaborate defensive mechanisms including portcullises and trap systems. The cultural achievements of the early dynastic period 2 and 3 paralleled and supported the military and political developments of this era. The intensification of interstate competition stimulated artistic production, literary creativity, and religious innovation that produced some of the most significant cultural monuments in Sumerian civilization. Royal patronage of artistic and literary projects served both aesthetic and political functions, celebrating military victories while legitimizing dynastic claims to political authority. The development of epic poetry during this period represents one of humanity's earliest experiments in sustained narrative literature. The earliest versions of the Gilgamesh epic, composed during the late early dynastic period, established literary conventions that would influence storytelling traditions throughout the ancient Near East. These early epic compositions combined historical memories of actual rulers and events with mythological elements that explored fundamental questions about heroism, mortality, and divine justice. Archaeological evidence suggests that epic poetry served important social and political functions beyond pure entertainment. Performance of epic compositions at royal courts and religious festivals provided opportunities for rulers to associate themselves with legendary heroes, while reinforcing cultural values that supported military prowess and political loyalty. The standardization of epic narratives across multiple city-states indicates the existence of professional bardic traditions that facilitated cultural exchange despite ongoing military conflicts. The artistic achievements of this period reflect both the increased wealth generated by territorial expansion and the competitive pressures driving cultural innovation. Royal workshops produced elaborate metalwork, carved stone monuments, and decorative objects that demonstrated technical mastery while celebrating military and political achievements. The quality and sophistication of these productions indicate the emergence of specialized artistic traditions supported by systematic training programs and substantial economic investment. The famous copperhead from Nineveh, traditionally identified as representing either Sargon of Akkad or an earlier Sumerian ruler, exemplifies the artistic achievements of the late early dynastic period. The sculpture's realistic portrayal of facial features, sophisticated understanding of human anatomy, and masterful metalworking techniques demonstrate the advanced capabilities of Sumerian artists and craftsmen. The work's combination of naturalistic representation with idealized royal imagery established artistic conventions that would influence Near Eastern art for centuries. Religious practices underwent significant development during this period, reflecting both the increased resources available for temple construction and the changing political relationships among city-states. The construction of massive ziggurat complexes at major religious centres represented unprecedented investments in sacred architecture, while serving important political functions in legitimizing territorial claims and interstate relationships. The temple complex at Nippur emerged as the preeminent religious centre of Sumer during this period, achieving a status that transcended the political boundaries separating individual city-states. The Ekur temple dedicated to Enlil became recognized as the supreme religious authority in Sumerian civilization, with rulers from multiple city-states seeking religious legitimation through ceremonies conducted at this sacred site. Archaeological evidence indicates that the Nippur temple complex served crucial functions in mediating interstate conflicts and establishing diplomatic protocols among competing city-states. Cuneiform archives from the site preserve records of territorial agreements, trade negotiations, and military treaties that were sanctified through religious ceremonies conducted under Enlil's divine authority. These diplomatic functions helped establish legal and religious frameworks that provided alternatives to purely military solutions for interstate disputes. The expansion of trade networks during this period reflected both the increased demand for luxury goods among competing elites and the military capabilities that enabled city-states to protect commercial routes and trading partners. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that Sumerian merchants established trading relationships, extending from the Indus Valley in the east to Anatolia in the north and Egypt in the west. These extensive commercial networks provided access to raw materials, finished goods, and technological innovations that supported both military capabilities and cultural development. The emergence of standardized weights and measures during the early dynastic period facilitated commercial exchange while reflecting the administrative sophistication achieved by Sumerian city-states. Archaeological recovery of standardized stone weights from multiple sites indicates the existence of coordinated systems for regulating commercial transactions across political boundaries. These standardization efforts required diplomatic cooperation among competing city-states and established precedents for the commercial law codes that would characterize later Mesopotamian civilizations. The military competitions and territorial expansions of the early dynastic period 2 and 3 created the political and cultural foundations that would enable the subsequent unification of Mesopotamia under Akkadian rule. The administrative systems, military technologies, and cultural traditions developed during this era of interstate warfare provided the institutional framework that Sargon of Akkad would employ to establish the world's first multi-ethnic empire during the late 24th century BC. The administrative systems and military technologies that emerged during the centuries of interstate warfare provided the foundation for the remarkable urban achievements that would define classical Sumerian civilization. By 2500 BC, 4 major city-states had established themselves as the dominant powers controlling distinct territorial domains across the Mesopotamian heartland. Each developed unique characteristics that reflected their geographical advantages, religious traditions, and economic specializations, yet all shared the sophisticated administrative capabilities and monumental architecture that marked the pinnacle of Sumerian urban development. Uruk maintained its position as the largest and most influential urban centre in Mesopotamia throughout the classical period, encompassing over 400 hectares within its massive defensive walls and controlling a territorial domain extending across more than 2,000 square kilometres of the central Euphrates region. The city's strategic location at the convergence of multiple canal systems provided unparalleled access to both riverine and overland trade routes, enabling Uruk's merchants to establish commercial networks that extended from the Persian Gulf to the Anatolian highlands. Archaeological excavations within Uruk's urban core have revealed the extraordinary scale and sophistication of the city's administrative infrastructure. The Anu precinct, centred around the White Temple complex, functioned as the primary governmental centre, housing elaborate archive rooms containing tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets documenting every aspect of urban administration. These archives preserve detailed records of tax collection, judicial proceedings, military organisation and commercial regulation that demonstrate the bureaucratic complexity required to govern such a massive urban population. The Yana precinct served as Uruk's primary religious and economic centre, dedicated to the goddess Inanna and functioning as the administrative headquarters for the city's extensive agricultural and commercial operations. Archaeological investigation of this complex has uncovered massive granaries capable of storing thousands of tons of barley and wheat, specialised workshops for textile production and metalworking, and residential quarters housing hundreds of priests, scribes, and skilled craftsmen. The precinct's elaborate courtyard systems facilitated the processing of agricultural tribute from rural settlements, while providing secure storage for valuable trade goods awaiting distribution to distant markets. The temple workshops within the Ariana precinct produced luxury goods that established Uruk's reputation throughout the ancient Near East for artistic and technical excellence. Master craftsmen working under temple patronage created elaborate jewellery, carved stone vessels and bronze implements that combined sophisticated technical execution with distinctive artistic styles. These productions served both religious functions within temple ceremonies and commercial purposes as high-value trade goods that could be exchanged for rare materials unavailable in southern Mesopotamia. Uruk's textile industry represented perhaps the most economically significant aspect of the city's craft production. Archaeological evidence indicates that temple workshops employed hundreds of women in spinning, weaving and finishing operations that produced both utilitarian fabrics for local consumption and luxury textiles for export to distant regions. The standardization of production techniques and the scale of manufacturing operations enabled Uruk's textile merchants to supply consistent quantities of high-quality fabrics to commercial partners throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. The city's administrative archives preserve detailed records of commercial expeditions that reveal the extraordinary geographical extent of Uruk's trading relationships. Merchant caravans organised under temple auspices conducted regular trading missions to highland regions seeking metals, stone and timber that were unavailable in the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia. These expeditions required substantial capital investment, sophisticated logistical planning, and diplomatic arrangements with foreign rulers that demonstrate the commercial sophistication achieved by Uruk's administrative institutions. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the broader region indicates that Uruk established permanent trading colonies in strategically important locations along major commercial routes. These colonies served as secure bases for merchant operations while providing local storage facilities and administrative centres that enabled more efficient commercial operations. The colonies also functioned as diplomatic outposts that facilitated political relationships with local rulers and provided intelligence about regional political developments that might affect commercial activities. The military capabilities that supported Uruk's commercial expansion reflected the city's substantial economic resources and administrative sophistication. Contemporary cuneiform sources describe professional military forces numbering in the thousands, organised into specialised units including heavy infantry, chariot forces, and engineering corps capable of conducting siege operations against fortified positions. The standardisation of military equipment and the systematic training programs employed by Uruk's armed forces established tactical doctrines that influenced military development throughout Mesopotamia. Ur emerged as the preeminent religious centre of southern Sumer, achieving a sacred status that transcended political boundaries and established the city as a pilgrimage destination for worshippers throughout the region. The massive ziggurat complex dedicated to the moon god Nana Sin dominated the urban landscape, rising over 60 metres above the surrounding plain and serving as both a religious monument and a symbol of Ur's spiritual authority. Archaeological investigation of this structure reveals construction techniques of extraordinary sophistication, with precisely calculated proportional relationships and advanced engineering solutions that enabled the massive mud brick superstructure to withstand centuries of weathering and seismic activity. The religious significance attributed to Nana Sin derived from ancient mythological traditions that identified the moon god as the divine patron of commercial activities and long-distance travel. This association made Ur's temple complex a natural focal point for merchant communities throughout Mesopotamia, who sought divine protection for their commercial ventures through elaborate ritual offerings and ceremonial procedures conducted under priestly supervision. The temple's archives preserve thousands of tablets documenting these commercial rituals, revealing the integration of the religious practice with economic activity that characterized Sumerian civilization. Ur's strategic location near the Persian Gulf provided unparalleled access to maritime trade routes that connected Mesopotamia with the Arabian Peninsula, the Indus Valley civilization, and other distant regions accessible by sea. Archaeological excavations have uncovered extensive harbour facilities including stone quays, warehouse complexes, and shipbuilding installations that supported a substantial maritime commerce. The technical sophistication of these facilities indicates that Ur's merchants had developed advanced knowledge of naval architecture and maritime navigation that enabled regular commercial voyages across hundreds of miles of open water. The famous royal cemetery at Ur provides dramatic evidence for the extraordinary wealth that flowed through the city's commercial networks during the mid-3rd millennium BC. The elaborate burial complexes discovered by archaeologists contained unprecedented quantities of gold, silver, lapis lazuli and other precious materials obtained through long-distance trade relationships. The technical quality of the metalwork, jewellery and decorative objects found in these burials demonstrates the presence of master craftsmen capable of working with exotic materials using sophisticated techniques that required years of specialised training. The cemetery's most spectacular burials involved the sacrifice of dozens of retainers who accompanied their rulers into the afterlife, creating an elaborate underground tableau that preserved detailed information about Sumerian court life, military organisation, and religious practices. The systematic arrangement of these sacrificial burials indicates carefully orchestrated ceremonial procedures that required extensive advanced planning and the coordination of multiple specialist groups, including priests, musicians, soldiers, and craftsmen. Archaeological analysis of the burial goods reveals extensive evidence for Ur's commercial relationships with distant regions. Lapis lazuli beads and inlays originated from mines in Afghanistan over 1,500 miles away, requiring complex logistical arrangements and diplomatic relationships with multiple intermediate trading partners. Carnelian beads displayed manufacturing techniques characteristic of Indus Valley workshops, indicating direct or indirect commercial contact with that sophisticated urban civilization. Gold and silver ornaments incorporated design elements that reflected artistic influences from highland regions, demonstrating the cultural exchange that accompanied commercial relationships. The administrative archives recovered from Ur's temple complexes preserve detailed records of the commercial expeditions that maintained these far-flung trading relationships. Merchant organizations operating under temple patronage conducted systematic trading missions that followed established routes and maintained permanent commercial relationships with foreign partners. These expeditions required substantial capital investment, with temple institutions providing initial funding in exchange for predetermined shares of commercial profits. Lagash developed into the most technologically advanced city-state in eastern Sumer, achieving particular prominence for its sophisticated irrigation engineering and legal innovations that influenced administrative practices throughout Mesopotamia. The city's location along the Tigris River and its major tributaries provided access to highland trade routes while offering exceptional opportunities for agricultural development through intensive irrigation agriculture. The irrigation systems constructed under Lagash's direction represented the most ambitious hydraulic engineering projects undertaken during the early dynastic period. Archaeological surveys have identified canal networks extending over hundreds of kilometres that channeled water from highland tributaries across vast expanses of previously arid territory. These systems incorporated sophisticated engineering features including regulated sluice gates, overflow channels, and settlement ponds that enabled precise control over water distribution while preventing the salt accumulation that plagued less carefully designed irrigation networks. The construction and maintenance of these massive irrigation systems required administrative capabilities of extraordinary sophistication. Contemporary cuneiform archives preserve detailed records of the bureaucratic procedures employed to coordinate construction activities, allocate maintenance responsibilities, and resolve disputes over water rights among multiple communities sharing common canal systems. These administrative innovations established legal precedents and institutional frameworks that would influence Mesopotamian water law for centuries. Gudea of Lagash emerged as the most celebrated ruler of the classical Sumerian period, conducting extensive building projects and legal reforms that demonstrated the administrative and technical capabilities achieved by Lagash's governmental institutions. Contemporary inscriptions describe Gudea's construction of over 15 major temple complexes, each incorporating architectural innovations and artistic achievements that established new standards for monumental architecture throughout Mesopotamia. The diorite statues of Gudea discovered by archaeologists provide detailed visual evidence for the artistic sophistication achieved under Lagash's patronage. These sculptures, carved from extremely hard stone imported from distant highland quarries, display technical mastery and artistic sensitivity that represent the pinnacle of Sumerian sculptural achievement. The inscriptions carved on these statues preserve valuable information about Gudea's building projects, legal reforms, and religious innovations that illuminate the governmental capabilities of classical Sumerian city-states. Lagash's legal innovations proved equally influential in establishing administrative precedents that would shape Mesopotamian jurisprudence for centuries. The legal codes promulgated under Lagash's authority addressed complex issues including property rights, commercial contracts, marriage and family law, and criminal justice procedures. These codes reflected sophisticated understanding of legal principles and demonstrated the systematic approach to governance that characterized mature Sumerian administrative institutions. The persistent conflicts between Lagash and neighbouring Ummah over water rights and territorial boundaries illustrate the intensity of competition that characterized intercity relationships during the classical period. These conflicts arose from the practical difficulties of managing shared irrigation systems that crossed political boundaries, creating situations where upstream construction projects could significantly impact downstream agricultural productivity. Archaeological evidence indicates that both city-states invested heavily in military fortifications and professional armed forces specifically designed to protect crucial water resources and agricultural territories. The border disputes between these city-states generated extensive diplomatic correspondence that provides valuable insights into Sumerian concepts of international law and territorial sovereignty. Boundary stelae erected at contested locations preserve detailed descriptions of territorial agreements, divine sanctions for boundary violations, and procedures for resolving disputes through arbitration rather than military action. These diplomatic innovations established precedents for peaceful conflict resolution that would influence Near Eastern international relations for centuries. Nippur achieved a unique position in Sumerian civilization as the acknowledged religious capital housing the supreme temple of Enlil, king of the gods, and serving as the ultimate source of legitimacy for royal authority throughout Mesopotamia. Unlike other major city-states that derive their power from territorial control and commercial wealth, Nippur's influence rested primarily on its religious significance and its role in sanctifying political relationships among competing city-states. The Ekur temple complex dedicated to Enlil represented the most sacred site in Sumerian religion, attracting pilgrims and royal visitors from throughout Mesopotamia who sought divine approval for their political and military endeavours. Archaeological investigation of this complex has revealed architectural features of extraordinary scale and sophistication, with massive ziggurat platforms, elaborate ceremonial courtyards, and specialised buildings housing the administrative apparatus required to manage the temple's extensive religious and economic functions. The religious ceremonies conducted at Nippur served crucial political functions in legitimising royal authority and mediating conflicts among competing city-states. Rulers throughout Mesopotamia sought formal recognition through elaborate investiture ceremonies conducted under Enlil's divine authority, creating a system of religious legitimation that transcended purely military or economic bases of political power. These ceremonies established diplomatic protocols and legal frameworks that provided alternatives to military conflict for resolving interstate disputes. The temple archives at Nippur preserve extensive records of the diplomatic activities that made the city a crucial mediating force in Sumerian interstate relations. Treaties, territorial agreements, and commercial contracts sanctified through religious ceremonies conducted at the Ekur temple created binding obligations that were enforced through divine sanction rather than purely secular authority. This system of religious diplomacy provided stability and predictability to interstate relationships that might otherwise have been dominated entirely by military competition. Nippur's central geographical location reinforced its political and religious significance, positioning the city at the convergence of major trade routes and canal systems that connected all regions of Mesopotamia. This strategic location enabled Nippur's religious authorities to maintain regular contact with rulers throughout the region, while facilitating the cultural exchange and diplomatic communication that supported the city's mediating functions. The scholarly traditions maintained at Nippur's temple complex established the city as the intellectual centre of Sumerian civilization, housing the most extensive libraries and scribal schools in Mesopotamia. These institutions preserved and transmitted the literary, legal, and technical knowledge that formed the cultural foundation of Sumerian civilization, training scribes and scholars who served governmental and religious institutions throughout the region. The intellectual traditions maintained at Nippur's temple complex created the institutional framework that would define the relationship between divine authority and earthly governance throughout Sumerian civilization. The Sumerian pantheon, as systematically codified by Nippur's scholarly priests, established a hierarchical divine order that directly paralleled and legitimized the political structures governing human society. At the apex stood An, the supreme sky god, whose authority encompassed all creation, followed by Enlil, the lord of wind and storm who exercised executive power over earthly affairs, and Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water who provided the technical knowledge necessary for civilization's survival. Each major city-state served as the earthly domain of a specific patron deity, creating a divine geography that sanctified territorial boundaries and political relationships. Uruk belonged to Inanna, the goddess of love and warfare whose dual nature reflected the city's commercial prosperity and military prowess. Served as the earthly residence of Nana Sin, the moon god whose cyclical journeys across the night sky governed the rhythms of trade and navigation. Lagash operated under the protection of Ningirsu, a warrior deity associated with irrigation agriculture and legal justice. This divine patronage system provided religious justification for territorial claims while establishing supernatural sanctions against violations of established boundaries and agreements. The temple complexes serving these patron deities functioned as much more than religious centres, operating as integrated economic, administrative, and spiritual institutions that controlled vast agricultural estates, manufacturing workshops, and commercial networks. The god's earthly residence required constant maintenance, elaborate ritual offerings, and continuous service from hundreds of priests, scribes, craftsmen, and labourers whose activities generated substantial economic surplus, while maintaining the spiritual relationships necessary for community prosperity. Archaeological evidence from temple archives reveals the extraordinary scope of institutional control exercised by these religious complexes. The Iana precinct at Uruk administered over 100,000 hectares of agricultural land, worked by thousands of dependent labourers who received standardised rations in exchange for their service. Temple workshops produced textiles, metalwork and luxury goods that supplied both local consumption and long-distance trade networks. Scribal schools trained the administrative personnel required to manage these complex operations while preserving and transmitting the technical knowledge necessary for maintaining irrigation systems, conducting legal proceedings, and organising military campaigns. The evolution of political leadership from religious to secular authority represented one of the most significant transformations in Sumerian governmental development. The earliest urban leaders, known by the Sumerian title Ensi, derived their authority entirely from their role as high priests responsible for maintaining proper relationships between their communities and patron deities. These priest rulers exercised power through their exclusive access to divine will, interpreting omens, conducting essential rituals, and managing the economic resources dedicated to religious service. The Ensi system proved increasingly inadequate for addressing the military challenges and administrative complexities that emerged during the early dynastic period. Interstate warfare required rapid decision-making, professional military leadership, and resource mobilization capabilities that exceeded the traditional limitations of religious authority. The practical demands of territorial defense and expansion created opportunities for military commanders to assume positions of significant political influence, initially serving as temporary war leaders appointed during specific crises, but gradually establishing permanent positions of secular authority. The emergence of the Lugal, literally meaning great man, marked the institutionalization of secular kingship within Sumerian political systems. Unlike the Ensi, whose authority derived from religious functions, the Lugal claimed legitimacy through military prowess, administrative competence, and divine appointment to earthly leadership roles. This transformation created dual power structures in many city-states, with religious and secular authorities sharing control over different aspects of governance according to carefully negotiated arrangements that varied among different political entities. The ideology of royal legitimacy developed sophisticated theological justifications for secular authority that integrated divine sanction with practical governmental functions. Kings claimed direct appointment by patron deities who had selected them for their exceptional capabilities in warfare, administration, and leadership. Royal inscriptions consistently emphasized the divine origins of kingly authority, while detailing specific achievements in military campaigns, construction projects, and legal reforms that demonstrated practical competence in governmental responsibilities. The famous Law Code of Unamu, dating to approximately 2100 BC but reflecting earlier legal traditions, provides detailed evidence for the governmental responsibilities attributed to divinely sanctioned kings. The code's prologue describes the king as appointed by the gods to establish justice, protect the weak, and ensure prosperity for all subjects within his domain. The specific legal provisions address property rights, commercial contracts, family relationships, and criminal justice procedures that demonstrate the comprehensive scope of royal authority over civilian life. Royal legitimacy required continuous validation through successful performance of governmental duties and maintenance of proper relationships with divine patrons. Kings who failed to achieve military victories, maintain economic prosperity, or conduct appropriate religious ceremonies risked losing divine favour and facing challenges from rival claimants to political authority. This system created powerful incentives for effective governance while providing mechanisms for peaceful transitions of power when rulers proved incompetent or unsuccessful. The architectural expression of royal ideology reached its pinnacle in the massive palace complexes constructed by successful kings throughout the classical Sumerian period. These structures served simultaneously as royal residences, administrative headquarters, ceremonial venues, and symbols of dynastic power that demonstrated the ruler's ability to mobilize resources and coordinate complex construction projects. Archaeological investigation of palace sites reveals architectural sophistication comparable to contemporary temple complexes, with elaborate courtyards, specialized administrative chambers, and residential quarters designed to accommodate the extensive household staffs required for royal governance. The palace at Mari, though dating to a slightly later period, exemplifies the architectural traditions established during the classical Sumerian era. The complex encompassed over 2.5 hectares and contained more than 300 rooms organised around multiple courtyards that facilitated different aspects of royal administration. Specialised areas included archive rooms housing thousands of cuneiform tablets, audience halls for conducting diplomatic receptions, residential quarters for royal family members and high officials, and workshop areas where skilled craftsmen produced luxury goods under royal patronage. The integration of religious and secular architecture within urban centres reflected the complex relationships between temple institutions and royal authority that characterised mature Sumerian political systems. Palace complexes were typically constructed adjacent to major temple precincts, creating architectural ensembles that visually demonstrated the cooperation between divine and earthly powers while maintaining distinct institutional identities. Ceremonial processional routes connected these complexes, enabling elaborate public rituals that reinforced the legitimacy of both religious and secular authorities. The economic foundation supporting these elaborate governmental systems rested on the sophisticated agricultural and commercial networks controlled by temple and palace institutions. The irrigation systems that enabled intensive agriculture across southern Mesopotamia required continuous investment in construction, maintenance, and expansion activities that could only be sustained through centralized resource mobilization and systematic labor organization. Temple and palace institutions developed complementary administrative systems that coordinated these activities while generating the economic surplus necessary for supporting complex urban societies. Agricultural estates, controlled by religious and secular institutions, employed thousands of dependent labourers organised into specialised work gangs responsible for different aspects of agricultural production. Field workers prepared soil, planted crops, and conducted harvest operations according to carefully planned schedules that maximised productivity while ensuring adequate labour availability for other institutional activities. Irrigation specialists maintained canal systems, operated water distribution facilities, and constructed new hydraulic infrastructure as agricultural expansion required additional water resources. The standardized ration systems employed by these institutions provided economic security for dependent laborers while enabling precise calculation of production costs and resource allocation. Workers received daily rations of barley, oil, and other essential commodities calculated according to their specific job responsibilities, family size, and institutional status. Skilled craftsmen and administrative personnel received enhanced rations that reflected their specialized training and greater economic value to institutional operations. Temple workshops operated under direct priestly supervision produced both religious objects required for ritual activities and commercial goods that generated revenue through long-distance trade networks. Master craftsmen working with precious metals, exotic stones, and imported materials created elaborate jewellery, decorative vessels, and ceremonial implements that demonstrated technical virtuosity while serving important religious and political functions. The standardization of production techniques and quality control procedures enabled these workshops to maintain consistent output levels while training new generations of skilled artisans. The social hierarchy that emerged from these economic and political systems created distinct legal categories with carefully defined rights and obligations that varied according to individual status and institutional affiliation. At the apex stood the royal family and high nobles, whose wealth derived from land ownership, commercial investments, and governmental positions that provided access to institutional resources. These elite groups maintained elaborate households staffed by numerous servants and retainers, while patronizing artistic and literary productions that celebrated their achievements and reinforced their social prominence. The priestly class occupied a unique position within this hierarchy, wielding significant influence through their religious functions, while maintaining economic interests that sometimes conflicted with royal policies. High-ranking priests controlled substantial temple resources, supervised large numbers of dependent workers, and participated in commercial activities that generated personal wealth alongside institutional revenues. The complex relationships between priestly and royal authority created ongoing tensions that required careful negotiation and periodic renegotiation of institutional boundaries. Merchants emerged as an increasingly important social group during the classical period, accumulating substantial wealth through participation in long-distance trade networks, while remaining subordinate to religious and royal authority in formal political terms. Successful merchants invested their profits in urban real estate, agricultural land, and commercial ventures that provided economic security while enabling social advancement through marriage alliances and patronage relationships with elite families. Skilled artisans occupied intermediate positions within the social hierarchy, enjoying economic security and social respect through their specialized knowledge, while remaining dependent on institutional patronage for access to raw materials and market opportunities. Master craftsmen who achieved recognition for exceptional skill could accumulate substantial personal wealth and establish workshops that trained apprentices and produced goods for both institutional and private clients. The agricultural population that formed the demographic foundation of Sumerian society included both free farmers who owned small plots of land and dependent labourers who worked institutional estates in exchange for standardised rations and protection. Free farmers participated in local governance through village assemblies that managed irrigation systems, resolved disputes, and coordinated agricultural activities, while dependent labourers remained subject to institutional authority that controlled their economic activities and residential arrangements. Slavery represented the lowest level of the social hierarchy, encompassing individuals who had lost their freedom through military capture, debt default, or criminal conviction. Slaves worked in various capacities including domestic service, agricultural labour, and craft production, with their treatment and opportunities for advancement varying according to their skills, institutional affiliation, and individual circumstances. The legal codes of the period established specific protections for slaves while maintaining their fundamental subordination to their owner's authority. The sophisticated legal systems that regulated Sumerian society underwent systematic refinement during the classical period, culminating in comprehensive reforms that addressed the practical challenges of governing complex urban populations while establishing precedents that would influence Near Eastern jurisprudence for millennia. The most significant of these reform movements occurred under Uruk of Lagash around 2350 BC, whose administrative innovations represented a deliberate attempt to address corruption, social inequality, and institutional abuse within existing governmental structures. Uruk reforms emerged from specific political circumstances that had created widespread dissatisfaction with existing administrative practices in Lagash. Contemporary cuneiform sources describe a period of institutional corruption during which temple officials and royal administrators had systematically exploited their positions to extract excessive fees from ordinary citizens, manipulate legal proceedings for personal advantage, and divert resources intended for public purposes to private enrichment. The accumulation of these abuses had generated social tensions that threatened the stability of Lagash's governmental institutions and undermined public confidence in traditional authority structures. The reform edicts promulgated by Uruk addressed these problems through systematic restructuring of administrative procedures and legal protections that established clear limitations on official authority while creating mechanisms for citizens to seek redress against governmental abuse. The edict specified maximum fees that officials could charge for various services, established standardized procedures for legal proceedings that prevented arbitrary manipulation of judicial outcomes, and created oversight mechanisms that enabled detection and punishment of administrative corruption. Archaeological evidence from Lagash's administrative archives demonstrates the practical implementation of these reforms through detailed records of fee schedules, judicial procedures, and oversight activities that show systematic adherence to the new regulatory framework. Temple officials maintained careful documentation of their financial transactions, legal decisions, and administrative activities that enabled regular auditing by supervisory authorities. Royal administrators operated under similar constraints that required detailed justification of their actions and regular reporting to higher authorities responsible for ensuring compliance with reform provisions. The social provisions included in Uruk reforms addressed fundamental issues of economic inequality and institutional exploitation that had generated popular discontent with existing governmental practices. The edicts established protections for widows, orphans, and economically vulnerable individuals who had previously been subject to exploitation by powerful officials and wealthy landowners. Debt relief provisions prevented the permanent enslavement of citizens who had fallen into financial difficulties, while land redistribution measures addressed the concentration of agricultural property that had reduced many farmers to dependent status. These legal innovations established principles of governmental accountability and citizen protection that represented unprecedented developments in ancient jurisprudence. The concept that governmental authority should be exercised within clearly defined legal constraints, subject to oversight mechanisms and citizen appeal procedures, created institutional frameworks that would influence legal development throughout the ancient Near East. The specific protections established for vulnerable populations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of social justice principles that would reappear in later legal codes throughout Mesopotamian civilization. The mathematical achievements of Sumerian civilization provided the computational foundation that enabled the complex administrative, architectural, and commercial activities that characterized classical urban society. Sumerian mathematicians developed the sexagesimal number system based on units of 60 that proved exceptionally well suited for practical calculations involving fractions, geometric measurements, and astronomical observations. This system's mathematical properties enabled precise calculations using relatively simple computational procedures that could be mastered by scribes and administrators without extensive mathematical training. The practical advantages of the sexagesimal system became apparent in its application to time measurement, where the division of hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds provided computational convenience that has persisted into modern usage. Similarly, the division of circles into 360 degrees reflected the sexagesimal system's geometric applications that enabled precise angular measurements for architectural construction, astronomical observation, and land surveying activities that required mathematical accuracy. Sumerian mathematical texts preserved in cuneiform archives demonstrate sophisticated understanding of geometric principles that enabled the construction of massive architectural projects with remarkable precision. Mathematical procedures for calculating areas, volumes, and proportional relationships provided the computational tools necessary for planning and executing construction projects involving millions of precisely manufactured bricks arranged according to complex architectural specifications. The accuracy achieved in major construction projects like the ziggurats at and Uruk demonstrates the practical effectiveness of these mathematical techniques. The development of standardized measurement systems complemented these mathematical innovations by providing consistent units for commercial transactions, construction projects, and administrative record keeping. Archaeological recovery of standardized weights and measuring devices from multiple sites indicates the existence of coordinated systems that enabled accurate measurement across different regions and institutions. These standardization efforts required diplomatic cooperation among competing city-states and established precedents for the commercial law codes that would characterize later Mesopotamian civilizations. Astronomical observations conducted by Sumerian priests provided the empirical foundation for calendar systems that regulated agricultural activities, religious ceremonies, and commercial operations according to predictable seasonal cycles. Temple-based astronomers maintained detailed records of celestial phenomena, including lunar phases, planetary movements, and stellar positions that enabled accurate prediction of seasonal changes and optimal timing for various economic activities. These observations required systematic data collection over extended periods and sophisticated mathematical analysis that demonstrated the scientific capabilities achieved by Sumerian scholarly institutions. The lunar calendar developed by Sumerian astronomers established the temporal framework that organized both religious and secular activities throughout Mesopotamian civilization. The division of the year into 12 lunar months, with periodic adjustments to maintain alignment with seasonal cycles, provided a practical system for scheduling agricultural operations, religious festivals, and commercial activities that required coordination among multiple communities and institutions. The mathematical precision required for calendar calculations demonstrated the integration of astronomical observation with computational techniques that characterize Sumerian scientific methodology. Architectural innovations developed during the classical Sumerian period established construction techniques and design principles that would influence Near Eastern architecture for over 2 millennia. The corbelled arch, created by progressively overlapping successive courses of stone or brick until the gap could be closed with a single capstone, enabled the construction of doorways, windows, and interior spaces that could span substantial distances without requiring wooden supports. This technique proved particularly valuable in southern Mesopotamia, where timber resources remained scarce and expensive throughout the ancient period. The engineering principles underlying corbelled arch construction required sophisticated understanding of structural mechanics and material properties that enabled architects to calculate load distributions, determine appropriate materials, and design supporting systems that could safely bear the substantial weights involved in monumental construction. Archaeological investigation of major Sumerian buildings reveals the systematic application of these principles in structures that have survived for over 4 millennia, despite the challenging environmental conditions of southern Mesopotamia. The development of dome construction techniques represented an even more significant architectural achievement that enabled the creation of large interior spaces without internal supporting columns. Early Sumerian domes employed the same corbelling principles used in arch construction, but applied them in circular rather than linear configurations that created self-supporting hemispherical structures capable of covering substantial floor areas. These techniques required precise mathematical calculations to ensure structural stability while maintaining the geometric proportions necessary for aesthetic effectiveness. Archaeological evidence from sites like Uruk and reveals the sophisticated construction techniques employed in dome building, including the use of temporary wooden frameworks that supported the structure during construction, specialized brick shapes designed to facilitate circular construction, and mortar compositions optimized for the specific structural requirements of domed architecture. The survival of these structures demonstrates the engineering competence achieved by Sumerian architects and the quality of materials and construction techniques employed in major building projects. Urban planning principles developed during the classical period established organizational frameworks that enabled the efficient functioning of cities housing tens of thousands of inhabitants, while maintaining the sanitary and logistical system necessary for urban survival. Sumerian city planners developed systematic approaches to street layout, drainage systems, residential zoning, and public facility placement that addressed the practical challenges of dense urban settlement in the challenging environmental conditions of southern Mesopotamia. The street systems of major Sumerian cities reflected careful planning that facilitated both pedestrian movement and commercial transportation, while providing access to residential areas and public facilities. Archaeological investigation reveals that major thoroughfares followed geometric patterns that connected important institutional centres, while maintaining consistent widths and drainage provisions that enabled effective maintenance and cleaning. Secondary streets provided access to residential quarters, while maintaining sufficient width for normal commercial activities and emergency access. Drainage systems represented crucial infrastructure investments that enabled urban survival in regions subject to seasonal flooding and periodic water shortages. Sumerian engineers developed sophisticated systems of covered drains, settling ponds, and overflow channels that managed both rainwater runoff and sewage disposal while preventing contamination of water supplies and residential areas. These systems required substantial initial investment and continuous maintenance that could only be sustained through centralized planning and resource allocation. Residential zoning practices segregated different social groups and economic activities according to systematic principles that maintained social hierarchies while enabling efficient urban functioning. Elite residential areas featured larger houses with private courtyards and specialized facilities, while ordinary residential quarters provided standardized housing units that maximized population density while maintaining basic sanitary and safety standards. Craft production areas were typically located near raw material sources and transportation facilities, while being separated from residential areas to minimize noise, pollution, and fire hazards. The economic systems that supported these urban achievements required sophisticated financial institutions and commercial practices that enabled large-scale resource mobilization, risk management, and long-distance trade coordination. Sumerian temples and palaces developed banking functions that provided credit for commercial ventures, agricultural investments, and construction projects while maintaining the detailed record-keeping necessary for tracking complex financial relationships over extended periods. Standardized weights and measures formed the foundation of these commercial systems by enabling accurate valuation of goods and services across different regions and institutions. Archaeological evidence indicates that Sumerian standards achieved remarkable consistency across multiple city-states, suggesting diplomatic coordination and mutual recognition agreements that facilitated interregional commerce. The precision of these standards, verified through modern measurement techniques, demonstrates the technical capabilities and quality control procedures employed by Sumerian craftsmen and administrators. Banking practices developed by temple institutions provided the financial services necessary for supporting complex commercial operations and large-scale construction projects. Temple archives preserve detailed records of loan agreements, interest calculations, and collateral arrangements that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of financial principles and risk management techniques. These institutions provided credit for merchant expeditions, agricultural investments, and craft production activities while maintaining the liquidity necessary for conducting normal institutional operations. Long-distance trade networks coordinated by Sumerian merchants established commercial relationships that extended from the Indus Valley to Anatolia and created the economic integration that facilitated cultural exchange throughout the ancient Near East. These networks required substantial capital investment, sophisticated logistical coordination, and diplomatic arrangements with foreign rulers that demonstrate the commercial capabilities achieved by Sumerian institutions. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout this vast region reveals the extent and intensity of these commercial relationships through the distribution of distinctive Sumerian artifacts and the presence of Mesopotamian influence in local material culture. The administrative systems that manage these complex economic activities employed thousands of trained scribes who maintained detailed records of commercial transactions, resource allocation, and institutional operations using standardized procedures that enabled accurate accounting and effective oversight. Scribal schools operated by temple and palace institutions provided systematic training in mathematical computation, legal procedures, and record-keeping techniques that created the administrative expertise necessary for managing sophisticated urban economies. The integration of these various innovations created institutional capabilities that enabled Sumerian city-states to maintain complex urban societies for over a millennium, while establishing cultural and technological precedents that would influence Near Eastern civilization throughout antiquity. The legal frameworks, mathematical techniques, architectural methods, and economic systems developed during the classical Sumerian period provided the foundation for subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations, while demonstrating the remarkable intellectual and organizational achievements possible within ancient urban societies. The sophisticated administrative systems and military technologies that had enabled Sumerian city-states to flourish for over 6 centuries created the very infrastructure that would facilitate their conquest by a foreign power originating from the northern regions of Mesopotamia. Around 2334 BC, a Semitic-speaking ruler named Sargon emerged from the city of Akkad, located somewhere in the region between modern Baghdad and Babylon, and initiated a series of military campaigns that would fundamentally transform the political landscape of ancient Mesopotamia and establish the world's first multi-ethnic empire. Sargon's origins remain shrouded in the legendary accounts that later Mesopotamian scribes wove around his remarkable rise to power. According to these traditions, he began his career as a cupbearer to Urzababa, king of Kish, before seizing power through a combination of military skill and political cunning. Archaeological evidence suggests that Sargon initially controlled only a modest territory around Akkad, but his strategic position along crucial trade routes and his ability to recruit effective military forces from the diverse populations of central Mesopotamia provided the foundation for his subsequent conquests. The military innovations that enabled Sargon's success reflected a fundamental transformation in warfare technology and tactics that gave Akkadian forces decisive advantages over traditional Sumerian military organizations. Sargon's armies employed composite bows constructed from laminated wood, horn, and sinew that provided significantly greater range and penetrating power than the simple wooden bows used by Sumerian forces. These weapons enabled Akkadian archers to engage enemy formations at distances that rendered traditional Sumerian tactics ineffective, while their superior accuracy allowed for selective targeting of key personnel within enemy ranks. Akkadian military organization emphasized mobility and flexibility over the rigid phalanx formations that had dominated Sumerian warfare for centuries. Sargon's forces operated in smaller, more manoeuvrable units that could rapidly concentrate against specific objectives before dispersing to avoid counterattack. This tactical approach proved particularly effective against the heavily armoured but slow-moving infantry formations that formed the backbone of Sumerian military power, enabling Akkadian forces to achieve local numerical superiority at crucial points while avoiding direct confrontation with enemy strengths. The integration of diverse ethnic groups within Sargon's military forces provided additional advantages through the combination of different military traditions and specialised capabilities. Semitic nomadic groups contributed superior archery skills and knowledge of desert warfare tactics, while highland populations provided expertise in siege warfare and mountain combat techniques. This diversity enabled Akkadian armies to adapt their tactics to specific operational requirements while maintaining the cohesion necessary for effective military coordination. Sargon's initial campaigns targeted the economically crucial but militarily vulnerable trade routes that connected Sumerian city-states with their commercial partners throughout the ancient Near East. By seizing control of these routes, Akkadian forces could simultaneously disrupt enemy economic resources while securing the commercial revenues necessary for sustaining prolonged military operations. Archaeological evidence from sites along major trade routes reveals extensive destruction layers dating to the mid-24th century BC, indicating the systematic nature of Sargon's economic warfare strategy. The siege of Uruk represented the first major test of Akkadian military capabilities against a fully fortified Sumerian city-state. Contemporary inscriptions describe a prolonged siege that lasted several months and required sophisticated engineering techniques to breach the massive defensive walls that had protected the city for centuries. Akkadian forces employed battering rams, siege towers, and undermining techniques that demonstrated advanced knowledge of siege warfare principles, while their superior archery capabilities enabled them to suppress defensive fire from the city's walls. The fall of Uruk sent shockwaves throughout the Sumerian world, as the city had been widely regarded as impregnable due to its massive fortifications and substantial garrison forces. Sargon's victory demonstrated that traditional Sumerian defensive strategies were inadequate against the new military technologies and tactics employed by Akkadian forces, forcing other city-states to reconsider their defensive preparations and military organizations. Following his success at Uruk, Sargon systematically reduced the remaining major Sumerian city-states through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic negotiation, and economic coercion. Submitted after a brief siege, when its rulers recognized the futility of prolonged resistance, while Lagash attempted to organize a coalition of eastern city-states that was defeated in a decisive battle near the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals widespread destruction at multiple sites, indicating the intensity of the military campaigns required to complete the Akkadian conquest of Sumer. The administrative integration of conquered Sumerian territories into the Akkadian Empire required sophisticated governmental innovations that could accommodate the cultural and linguistic diversity of the new imperial domain while maintaining effective central control. Sargon adopted a pragmatic approach that preserved existing Sumerian administrative institutions while overlaying them with Akkadian supervisory structures that ensured imperial authority without completely disrupting local governmental traditions. Bilingual administration emerged as a crucial innovation that enabled effective governance of the linguistically diverse imperial population. Akkadian became the language of imperial administration and military command, while Sumerian continued to function as the language of religious ceremony, legal proceedings, and scholarly activity. This linguistic arrangement required extensive translation services and created opportunities for cultural exchange that would profoundly influence both Akkadian and Sumerian intellectual traditions. The training of bilingual scribes became a priority for imperial educational institutions, as effective governance required administrators capable of communicating with both Akkadian imperial authorities and Sumerian local populations. Scribal schools established in major cities throughout the empire provided systematic instruction in both cuneiform writing systems, creating a professional class of administrators who could facilitate communication across linguistic boundaries while maintaining the detailed record-keeping necessary for imperial administration. Religious practices underwent significant transformation under Akkadian rule, as imperial authorities sought to integrate Sumerian religious traditions with Akkadian theological concepts while maintaining the divine legitimacy necessary for effective governance. Sargon and his successors adopted many Sumerian deities into the Akkadian pantheon, while elevating their own patron gods to positions of supreme authority within the integrated religious system. This syncretic approach enabled the preservation of local religious traditions while establishing imperial religious authority that transcended traditional city-state boundaries. The elevation of Marduk, originally a relatively minor Akkadian deity, to a position of supreme authority within the imperial pantheon, represented a crucial development in Mesopotamian religious thought. Imperial theologians developed elaborate mythological narratives that justified Marduk's supremacy over traditional Sumerian deities like Enlil and An, creating religious frameworks that legitimized Akkadian political authority while maintaining continuity with established religious traditions. Temple institutions throughout the empire underwent administrative reorganization that integrated them into imperial governmental structures while preserving their essential religious and economic functions. Akkadian administrators assumed supervisory roles over major temple complexes, ensuring imperial control over the substantial economic resources managed by religious institutions, while maintaining the ritual activities that local populations regarded as essential for community prosperity. The economic integration of Sumerian city-states into the Akkadian imperial system created unprecedented opportunities for commercial expansion and resource mobilization, while requiring new administrative mechanisms for managing economic activities across vast geographical distances. Imperial authorities established standardized systems for tribute collection, commercial regulation, and resource allocation that enabled more efficient economic coordination than had been possible under the fragmented city-state system. Tribute assessments imposed on conquered territories reflected careful calculation of local economic capabilities and strategic importance within the broader imperial system. Agricultural regions provided grain, livestock, and other food products that supported imperial armies and administrative centres, while specialised craft production areas contributed manufactured goods that could be redistributed throughout the empire or exported to foreign trading partners. The systematic nature of these tribute arrangements enabled imperial authorities to predict and plan resource allocation with unprecedented accuracy. Commercial standardization initiatives implemented throughout the empire facilitated long-distance trade by establishing consistent weights, measures, and currency systems that enabled merchants to conduct business across political boundaries without constant renegotiation of basic commercial terms. Archaeological evidence indicates that Akkadian standards achieved remarkable consistency across the imperial domain, suggesting effective enforcement mechanisms and widespread acceptance of imperial commercial authority. The construction of imperial road networks and communication systems enabled more rapid movement of goods, personnel, and information throughout the empire than had been possible under previous political arrangements. These infrastructure investments required substantial initial capital expenditure, but generated long-term economic benefits through reduced transportation costs and improved commercial coordination. Archaeological surveys have identified remains of Akkadian period roads, way stations, and communication facilities that demonstrate the scope and sophistication of these infrastructure projects. Despite these administrative achievements, Akkadian rule generated persistent resistance movements throughout the former Sumerian territories that reflected deep-seated cultural attachments to traditional political and religious institutions. These resistance activities range from passive non-cooperation with imperial authorities to organise military rebellions that required substantial imperial resources to suppress. Cultural preservation efforts by Sumerian intellectual elites represented perhaps the most significant form of resistance to Akkadian cultural assimilation policies. Sumerian priests, scribes, and scholars systematically preserved traditional literary works, religious practices, and historical memories through careful copying and transmission of cuneiform texts that maintained Sumerian cultural identity despite political subordination. Archaeological recovery of Sumerian literary texts from Akkadian period contexts demonstrates the persistence of these preservation activities throughout the imperial period. The compilation of the Sumerian king list during this period served important political functions in maintaining Sumerian historical consciousness and legitimizing claims to eventual political restoration. This document, which traced the history of legitimate rule from the earliest mythical kings through the Akkadian conquest, provided a framework for understanding current political arrangements as temporary disruptions of proper Sumerian governance, rather than permanent transformations of the political order. Religious resistance took the form of continued emphasis on traditional Sumerian deities and ritual practices, despite imperial promotion of Akkadian religious innovations. Local communities maintained traditional festivals, temple ceremonies, and religious observances that reinforced Sumerian cultural identity, while providing opportunities for covert political organisation. Imperial authorities generally tolerated these activities as long as they did not directly challenge imperial political authority, but tensions occasionally erupted into open conflicts that required military intervention. The revolt of Lugalzagesi of Uruk during the later years of Sargon's reign represented the most serious military challenge to Akkadian imperial authority during the conquest period. This rebellion drew support from multiple former city-states and required extensive military campaigns to suppress, demonstrating the persistent appeal of Sumerian political independence, despite the practical advantages of imperial integration. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with this revolt reveals extensive fortification efforts and military preparations that indicate the seriousness of the challenge posed to imperial stability. Economic resistance manifested through various forms of non-cooperation, with imperial tribute requirements, commercial regulations, and labour obligations imposed by Akkadian authorities. Agricultural communities occasionally withheld surplus production, craft workshops reduced output levels, and merchant organisations disrupted trade networks in efforts to pressure imperial authorities for policy modifications. These economic pressures required careful management by imperial administrators who needed to maintain sufficient economic resources for imperial operations while avoiding policies that would generate widespread popular opposition. The persistence of Sumerian identity under Akkadian rule reflected the deep cultural roots that had developed during centuries of independent city-state development and the institutional structures that continued to function despite political subordination. Sumerian language remained the preferred medium for religious and scholarly activities. Sumerian legal traditions continued to govern local disputes and commercial relationships, and Sumerian artistic and architectural styles influenced imperial cultural production throughout the Akkadian period. Educational institutions played crucial roles in maintaining Sumerian cultural transmission, despite imperial political control. Scribal schools continued to provide instruction in Sumerian literature, religious traditions, and historical knowledge alongside the Akkadian administrative training required for imperial service. This dual educational system created generations of bilingual intellectuals who could participate in imperial administration while maintaining connection to traditional Sumerian cultural values. Intermarriage between Akkadian and Sumerian populations created complex cultural dynamics that facilitated both cultural integration and cultural preservation within the imperial system. These relationships enabled cultural exchange that enriched both traditions while creating family networks that transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries. Archaeological evidence from residential areas in major cities reveals mixed material culture assemblages that reflect the complex cultural negotiations occurring within these integrated communities. The long-term success of the Akkadian Empire in maintaining control over Sumerian territories while accommodating persistent cultural resistance demonstrated the effectiveness of imperial policies that balanced central control with local autonomy. This administrative model would influence subsequent Mesopotamian empires for centuries, establishing precedents for managing culturally diverse imperial populations that would be refined and adapted by later rulers throughout the ancient Near East. The administrative model established by the Akkadian Empire ultimately proved unsustainable in the face of mounting external pressures and internal rebellions that culminated in the empire's collapse around 2154 BC. The final blow came from the Gutians, a mountain people from the Zagros region, who swept down into the Mesopotamian plains and systematically destroyed Akkadian administrative centres while establishing their own loose confederation of tribal kingdoms. This period of political fragmentation, lasting roughly 4 decades, witnessed the gradual erosion of imperial infrastructure and the return of localized governance structures that would provide the foundation for Sumerian political revival. The Gutian occupation represented a fundamental disruption of the sophisticated administrative and economic systems that had characterized both Sumerian city-states and the Akkadian Empire. Archaeological evidence from major urban centres reveals widespread destruction of palace complexes, temple archives, and commercial facilities that had supported complex governmental operations. The Gutians, lacking the administrative expertise necessary for managing urban societies, allowed irrigation systems to deteriorate, craft production to decline, and trade networks to fragment into localized exchanges that could no longer support the population densities achieved during earlier periods. Local Sumerian leaders gradually emerged from this chaos by reasserting control over their traditional territories and rebuilding the institutional capabilities necessary for effective urban governance. The process began in the southern regions where Sumerian cultural traditions had remained strongest despite Akkadian political dominance. Ur-Nammu, initially serving as governor of Ur under nominal Gutian authority, systematically expanded his control over surrounding territories while rebuilding the military and administrative capabilities necessary for challenging Gutian dominance throughout southern Mesopotamia. The expulsion of the Gutians required coordinated military action that demonstrated the revival of Sumerian organizational capabilities under Ur-Nammu's leadership. Contemporary inscriptions describe systematic campaigns that targeted Gutian strongholds while avoiding direct confrontation with their main forces, employing tactics that emphasized mobility and local knowledge over brute force. The success of these operations reflected both improved military organization and popular support from Sumerian populations eager to restore traditional governmental institutions. Ur-Nammu's establishment of the Third Dynasty of Ur around 2112 BC marked the beginning of the most remarkable political and cultural revival in ancient Mesopotamian history. Unlike the earlier Sumerian city-states that had remained politically fragmented despite cultural unity, the new dynasty created a centralized territorial state that combined traditional Sumerian cultural values with administrative innovations derived from Akkadian imperial experience. This synthesis produced governmental capabilities that exceeded those achieved by either earlier political system, while maintaining the cultural authenticity that legitimized Sumerian rule in the eyes of local populations. The territorial extent controlled by the Third Dynasty surpassed that of any previous Sumerian political entity, encompassing virtually all of southern Mesopotamia and extending into highland regions that had never been subject to sustained Sumerian control. Archaeological surveys have identified administrative installations, military outposts, and commercial facilities throughout this vast territory that demonstrate the systematic nature of Neo-Sumerian territorial organization. The dynasty's control extended from the Persian Gulf to the Middle Euphrates region, creating an integrated economic and political system that rivaled the Akkadian Empire in scope while maintaining distinctly Sumerian institutional characteristics. Administrative innovations implemented under Ur-Nammu reflected sophisticated understanding of the governmental challenges involved in managing such extensive territories while maintaining cultural and political legitimacy. The dynasty employed a hierarchical system of provincial governors who reported directly to the king while maintaining substantial autonomy in managing local affairs. These governors, typically drawn from established Sumerian noble families, possessed the cultural credentials necessary for local legitimacy, while demonstrating loyalty to dynastic authority through their administrative performance and military service. The integration of Akkadian administrative techniques with traditional Sumerian governmental practices created hybrid institutions that combined the efficiency of imperial administration with the cultural authenticity of traditional city-state governance. Bilingual record-keeping continued from the Akkadian period, enabling communication across linguistic boundaries, while preserving Sumerian as the primary language of official documentation. This linguistic policy reinforced Sumerian cultural identity while maintaining practical administrative capabilities developed during the imperial period. Military organization under the Third Dynasty reflected lessons learned from both the Akkadian conquest and the Gutian occupation, combining traditional Sumerian military values with tactical innovations that address contemporary strategic requirements. The dynasty maintained professional military forces organized around regional recruitment centers that provided systematic training in both traditional infantry tactics and newer archery techniques. These forces operated under standardized command structures that enabled coordinated operations across vast geographical distances while maintaining the flexibility necessary for responding to diverse tactical situations. The construction of fortified administrative centers throughout the dynasty's territory demonstrated the systematic approach to territorial control that characterized Neo-Sumerian governance. These installations, typically featuring massive defensive walls, residential quarters for administrative personnel, and storage facilities for tribute collection, served as regional headquarters that enabled effective supervision of local affairs while providing secure bases for military operations. Archaeological investigation of these sites reveals sophisticated planning and construction techniques that reflect substantial investment in territorial infrastructure. Under Shulgi, who succeeded his father Ur-Nammu around 2094 BC, the Third Dynasty achieved its greatest territorial extent and administrative sophistication. Shulgi's reign, lasting 48 years, provided the political stability necessary for implementing comprehensive reforms that touched every aspect of Neo-Sumerian society. His administrative innovations established governmental procedures and institutional frameworks that would influence Mesopotamian political development for centuries, while demonstrating the remarkable organizational capabilities achieved by the revived Sumerian state. The massive building projects undertaken during Shulgi's reign represented the most ambitious construction program in Mesopotamian history, surpassing even the achievements of the early Sumerian city-states in scale and architectural sophistication. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, begun under Ur-Nammu but completed during Shulgi's reign, rose over 70 meters above the surrounding plain and required more than 15 million bricks manufactured according to precise specifications. The structure's mathematical proportions reflected advanced geometric knowledge, while its construction techniques demonstrated engineering capabilities that enabled the creation of stable, massive structures using locally available materials. Archaeological investigation of the ziggurat's construction reveals the sophisticated organizational systems required for such massive projects. Specialized brick-making installations produce standardized building materials according to quality control procedures that ensured structural integrity throughout the massive superstructure. Transportation systems moved millions of bricks from production sites to construction areas using carefully planned logistics that minimized handling time while maintaining construction schedules. labour organisation involved thousands of workers organised into specialised teams responsible for different aspects of construction under professional supervision that coordinated activities according to detailed construction plans. The ziggurat's architectural design incorporated drainage systems, ventilation features, and structural reinforcements that reflected advanced understanding of engineering principles and environmental challenges. Internal ramps enabled movement of materials and personnel throughout the structure during construction, while external staircases provided ceremonial access routes that enhanced the building's religious and political functions. The precision achieved in the structure's proportional relationships and geometric alignments demonstrates mathematical capabilities that required systematic training and institutional support for technical education. Canal construction projects undertaken during this period created the most extensive irrigation network in Mesopotamian history, transforming vast areas of previously marginal land into highly productive agricultural territories that supported unprecedented population densities. The Shatt al-Garif Canal, extending over 300 kilometers from the Tigris to the Euphrates, represented the largest single hydraulic engineering project attempted in the ancient world. Archaeological surveys have traced the canal's route across difficult terrain that required sophisticated surveying techniques and massive earth-moving operations that employed tens of thousands of workers over multiple construction seasons. The engineering challenges involved in canal construction required innovations in surveying, excavation, and water control that advanced Mesopotamian hydraulic technology beyond previous achievements. Surveyors employed geometric principles to calculate precise gradients that maintained water flow over vast distances while preventing erosion and siltation problems that had plagued earlier irrigation systems. Construction techniques included the use of standardized excavation tools, systematic earth removal procedures, and quality control measures that ensured consistent canal dimensions throughout extended construction projects. Water control structures incorporated into these canal systems demonstrated sophisticated understanding of hydraulic principles and practical engineering solutions for managing large-scale water distribution. Regulated sluice gates enabled precise control over water flow into secondary distribution channels, while overflow systems prevented flood damage during periods of high water. Maintenance procedures established systematic inspection schedules and repair protocols that enabled long-term operation of these complex systems despite the challenging environmental conditions of southern Mesopotamia. The agricultural productivity achieved through these irrigation investments supported population levels that may have reached 1.5 million people within the dynasty's core territories, representing the highest population density achieved in the ancient world prior to the Roman Empire. This demographic achievement required not only agricultural abundance, but also sophisticated systems for food distribution, urban planning, and resource management that could sustain large urban populations while maintaining rural agricultural productivity. Urban planning principles implemented during this period reflected systematic approaches to city organisation that addressed the practical challenges of managing dense populations while maintaining sanitary conditions and social order. Major cities featured planned residential districts with standardised housing units that maximised population density while providing adequate living conditions for different social classes. Commercial areas were strategically located near transportation facilities and storage centres that facilitated efficient distribution of goods and services throughout urban populations. The Code of Urnamu, promulgated during the early years of the dynasty but refined throughout Shulgi's reign, represented the most comprehensive legal framework developed in the ancient world prior to Hammurabi's more famous code. The legal provisions addressed virtually every aspect of social and economic relationships within Neo-Sumerian society, while establishing procedural frameworks that ensured consistent application of legal principles across the dynasty's extensive territories. Property law provisions within the code addressed complex issues involving agricultural land, urban real estate, and commercial assets that reflected the sophisticated economic relationships characterizing Neo-Sumerian society. Land tenure regulations established clear procedures for property transfer, inheritance rights, and dispute resolution that provided legal security for agricultural and commercial investments. Commercial law provisions regulated contracts, partnerships, and trading relationships while establishing standardized procedures for resolving business disputes through formal legal proceedings. Family law sections of the code addressed marriage contracts, divorce procedures, child custody arrangements, and inheritance rights that reflected changing social conditions within Neo-Sumerian society. Marriage regulations established property rights for both spouses while creating legal frameworks that protected the interests of children and extended family members. Divorce provisions enabled legal dissolution of marriages under specified circumstances while ensuring equitable distribution of marital property and appropriate arrangements for child support. Criminal law provisions established systematic penalties for various offences while creating procedural safeguards that prevented arbitrary punishment and ensured consistent application of legal standards. The code distinguished between different categories of crimes and established proportional punishments that reflected the severity of offences while considering the social status of both perpetrators and victims. Procedural requirements included evidentiary standards, witness testimony protocols, and appeal mechanisms that provided legal protections for accused individuals while maintaining effective law enforcement. Administrative reforms implemented during Shulgi's reign created governmental institutions of unprecedented sophistication that enabled effective management of the dynasty's extensive territories while maintaining detailed oversight of local administrative activities. Provincial administration operated through hierarchical systems that balanced central control with local autonomy, enabling responsive governance that could address regional variations while maintaining policy consistency throughout the dynastic territories. Taxation systems developed during this period established systematic procedures for tribute collection that provided predictable revenues for governmental operations while avoiding excessive burdens that might generate popular resistance. Assessment procedures evaluated local economic capabilities and established tribute requirements that reflected productive capacity while considering local circumstances that might affect payment abilities. Collection procedures employed professional tax administrators who maintained detailed records of payments and ensured consistent application of assessment standards throughout the dynasty's territories. Record-keeping systems maintained by Neo-Sumerian administrators generated the most extensive governmental archives preserved from the ancient world, providing detailed documentation of administrative procedures, legal decisions, and economic activities that illuminate every aspect of dynastic governance. These archives, preserved in cuneiform tablets numbering in the tens of thousands, demonstrate the systematic approach to documentation that enabled effective oversight of complex governmental operations across vast geographical distances. The cultural renaissance that accompanied these political and administrative achievements produced literary, artistic, and scholarly works that established standards of excellence that would influence Mesopotamian cultural development for centuries. Royal patronage supported artistic workshops, scribal schools, and scholarly institutions that created cultural productions celebrating dynastic achievements while preserving and transmitting traditional Sumerian cultural values to future generations. Literary production during this period included systematic compilation and standardization of traditional Sumerian epic narratives, religious texts, and historical chronicles that established canonical versions of cultural works that had previously existed in multiple local variations. The standardization process involved scholarly comparison of different textual traditions, editorial decisions about preferred readings, and systematic copying procedures that ensured consistent transmission of approved versions. These editorial activities created the literary corpus that would serve as the foundation for Mesopotamian education and cultural identity throughout subsequent periods. Artistic achievements during the Neo-Sumerian period combined traditional Sumerian aesthetic values with technical innovations that produced works of extraordinary quality and sophistication. Royal workshops produced elaborate metalwork, carved stone monuments, and decorative objects that demonstrated mastery of technical procedures while celebrating dynastic achievements and religious themes. The integration of traditional artistic motifs with contemporary political imagery created distinctive artistic styles that influenced Near Eastern art for centuries, while maintaining clear connections to earlier Sumerian cultural traditions. The religious practices that had undergone systematic reorganization during the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance would face their greatest challenge as external pressures mounted throughout the 20th century BC. The sophisticated administrative systems and cultural achievements of the Third Dynasty of Ur, despite their remarkable scope and effectiveness, could not indefinitely withstand the combination of environmental degradation, demographic pressures, and military threats that would ultimately transform the political landscape of Mesopotamia and herald the end of independent Sumerian civilization. The Amorite tribes that had been gradually infiltrating the western and northern frontiers of Mesopotamia since the late 3rd millennium BC represented a fundamentally different challenge from the Gutian raids that had disrupted the Akkadian Empire. Unlike the Gutians, who had remained largely nomadic raiders seeking plunder rather than permanent settlement, the Amorites arrived as organised tribal confederations seeking agricultural land and urban bases for establishing permanent political control. Their Semitic language and pastoral traditions created cultural barriers that complicated diplomatic solutions, while their military organisation around kinship networks provided resilience that made them difficult to defeat through conventional warfare. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Euphrates and Tigris rivers reveals the systematic nature of Amorite settlement patterns during the early 2nd millennium BC. Rather than establishing entirely new communities, Amorite groups typically occupied existing urban centres and agricultural settlements, gradually assuming control over local administrative functions while maintaining basic economic and social structures. This approach enabled them to benefit from established irrigation systems, craft production facilities, and trade networks without requiring the technical expertise necessary for creating these complex systems from scratch. The military tactics employed by Amorite forces reflected their pastoral origins and nomadic traditions, emphasizing mobility, surprise attacks, and rapid withdrawal rather than the siege warfare and territorial occupation that had characterized earlier Mesopotamian conflicts. Amorite warriors employed composite bows and light cavalry tactics that proved highly effective against the heavily armoured infantry formations that form the backbone of Neo-Sumerian military power. Their ability to strike quickly at vulnerable targets before disappearing into desert regions where pursuing forces could not effectively operate created persistent security problems that strained Neo-Sumerian resources and undermined confidence in dynastic military capabilities. The gradual erosion of Neo-Sumerian territorial control occurred through a process of incremental losses rather than dramatic military defeats, as Amorite pressure forced the abandonment of outlying administrative centres and the concentration of dynastic forces around core urban areas. Contemporary cuneiform sources document the systematic withdrawal of Neo-Sumerian garrisons from frontier regions, the disruption of tribute collection from peripheral territories, and the increasing frequency of Amorite raids against major urban centres that had previously been considered secure from external attack. Hammurabi's rise to power in Babylon around 1792 BC marked the culmination of Amorite political consolidation throughout central Mesopotamia and the beginning of systematic campaigns to incorporate former Neo-Sumerian territories into a new imperial structure. Unlike earlier conquerors who had sought to preserve existing administrative systems while overlaying them with new political authority, Hammurabi implemented comprehensive reforms that fundamentally transformed the governmental, legal, and cultural frameworks that had characterized Mesopotamian civilization for over a millennium. The siege of Ur in 1740 BC represented the final military confrontation between Neo-Sumerian and Amorite forces, ending over a century of intermittent warfare that had gradually reduced the Third Dynasty's territorial control to a small region around the ancient religious centre. Archaeological excavations at Ur have revealed extensive destruction layers dating to this period, including burned administrative buildings, damaged residential areas, and disrupted craft production facilities that indicate the intensity of the final assault. The systematic nature of the destruction suggests deliberate efforts to eliminate the institutional infrastructure that had supported Neo-Sumerian governance rather than simple military occupation. Contemporary cuneiform sources describe the siege in terms that emphasize the religious and cultural significance of Ur's fall, rather than purely military aspects of the conquest. The capture of the city's patron deity Nana-Sin and the destruction of the great Ziggurat's temple complex represented symbolic victories that demonstrated the transfer of divine favour from Sumerian to Amorite rulers. These religious dimensions of the conquest facilitated Amorite legitimacy among local populations, who might otherwise have continued to resist foreign political authority. The integration of former Sumerian territories into Hammurabi's Babylonian kingdom required administrative innovations that could accommodate the cultural and linguistic diversity of the conquered populations, while maintaining effective central control over vast geographical distances. Hammurabi's approach differed significantly from earlier imperial models by establishing uniform legal and administrative systems throughout his territories rather than preserving local institutional variations under imperial supervision. This standardization process involved the systematic replacement of traditional Sumerian legal procedures with Babylonian alternatives that reflected Amorite cultural values and governmental practices. The famous Law Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on massive stone stelae and displayed in major cities throughout the kingdom, represented the most comprehensive attempt to establish uniform legal standards across culturally diverse territories in ancient Mesopotamian history. The code's provisions addressed virtually every aspect of social and economic relationships, while establishing procedural frameworks that superseded traditional Sumerian legal practices. Property law sections established new principles for land tenure and inheritance that reflected Amorite kinship traditions rather than Sumerian urban commercial practices. Commercial regulations incorporated pastoral economic concepts that differed substantially from the sophisticated urban commercial law that had characterized Sumerian city-states. Environmental challenges that had been developing throughout the Neo-Sumerian period reached critical levels during the early 2nd millennium BC, creating agricultural and demographic pressures that weakened Sumerian resistance to Amorite conquest, while facilitating the political transformation of Mesopotamian society. The salinization of agricultural land, caused by centuries of intensive irrigation without adequate drainage, gradually reduced crop yields throughout southern Mesopotamia and forced the abandonment of previously productive agricultural areas. Archaeological soil analysis from sites throughout the former Sumerian heartland reveals the systematic accumulation of salt deposits in agricultural fields during the early 2nd millennium BC, with salt concentrations reaching levels that prevented successful cultivation of traditional crops. Barley, which had formed the foundation of Mesopotamian agriculture for millennia, became increasingly difficult to grow in affected areas, while wheat cultivation became virtually impossible in regions where salt accumulation was most severe. These agricultural problems forced rural populations to abandon traditional farming communities and migrate to urban centres, creating demographic pressures that strained urban food supplies and social services. The hydrological changes that accompanied salinization included the gradual alteration of river courses that disrupted established irrigation systems and required massive investments in canal reconstruction and maintenance. The Euphrates River, which had provided the primary water source for many major Sumerian cities, shifted its course eastward during this period, leaving established urban centres increasingly dependent on artificial canal systems that required constant maintenance and periodic reconstruction. These hydrological challenges demanded engineering expertise and financial resources that exceeded the capabilities of politically fragmented communities struggling with military pressures and economic disruption. Siltation problems in major canal systems created additional maintenance burdens that required coordinated labour mobilisation across multiple political jurisdictions. The accumulation of sediment in canal channels reduced water flow capacity and required periodic dredging operations that involved thousands of workers organised under centralised supervision. The political fragmentation that accompanied Amorite conquest made such coordination increasingly difficult, leading to the gradual deterioration of irrigation infrastructure that had supported Mesopotamian civilization for over 2 millennia. The linguistic transformation that occurred during this period represented one of the most significant cultural changes in ancient Mesopotamian history, as Akkadian gradually displaced Sumerian as the primary spoken language throughout the region, while Sumerian survived only in religious, legal, and scholarly contexts. This linguistic shift reflected broader demographic changes as Semitic-speaking populations became numerically dominant throughout Mesopotamia, while Sumerian speakers became concentrated in urban centres and religious institutions that maintained traditional cultural practices. Bilingual education systems developed during the transition period provided training in both Sumerian and Akkadian languages, enabling cultural continuity while facilitating communication across linguistic boundaries. Scribal schools maintained instruction in Sumerian cuneiform writing, while adding Akkadian language training that prepared students for administrative careers in the new political environment. These educational institutions played crucial roles in preserving Sumerian literary and scholarly traditions, while adapting them to contemporary political and cultural requirements. The preservation of Sumerian religious texts required systematic translation and commentary activities that ensured the survival of traditional theological knowledge while making it accessible to Akkadian-speaking populations. Priestly scholars developed elaborate interpretive frameworks that explained Sumerian religious concepts in Akkadian terminology, while maintaining the essential theological content that legitimized traditional ritual practices. These scholarly activities created extensive bilingual archives that would serve as sources for Mesopotamian religious and literary knowledge for centuries. Legal terminology underwent gradual transformation as Akkadian legal concepts replaced traditional Sumerian jurisprudential frameworks, creating hybrid legal systems that combined elements from both cultural traditions while establishing new procedural standards that reflected contemporary political requirements. Professional legal scribes developed specialized vocabularies that enabled accurate translation of legal concepts between languages while maintaining the precision necessary for effective judicial proceedings. These linguistic innovations facilitated the integration of Sumerian legal precedents into Babylonian jurisprudential systems while preserving traditional legal knowledge that continued to influence Mesopotamian law for centuries. The transformation of former city-states into provincial centres within larger territorial kingdoms represented a fundamental reorganisation of political authority that eliminated the local autonomy that had characterised Sumerian political organisation for over a millennium. Traditional city-state institutions, including local assemblies, autonomous temple administrations, and independent military forces, were systematically incorporated into hierarchical governmental structures that concentrated decision-making authority in royal capitals, while reducing local communities to administrative subdivisions within larger political entities. Provincial governors appointed by central authorities assumed administrative responsibilities that had previously been exercised by local rulers, traditional assemblies, and temple institutions. These governors, typically drawn from Amorite noble families or Babylonian administrative personnel, possessed the political connections and cultural credentials necessary for maintaining central authority, while lacking the local roots that might have enabled independent political action. Their administrative activities focused on tribute collection, law enforcement, and military recruitment rather than the comprehensive governmental functions that had characterized traditional city-state rulers. Temple institutions underwent administrative reorganization that subordinated traditional religious autonomy to royal supervision, while maintaining the ritual functions that local populations regarded as essential for community prosperity. Royal appointees assumed supervisory roles over major temple complexes, controlling financial resources and personnel decisions, while allowing traditional priestly hierarchies to continue conducting religious ceremonies according to established procedures. This arrangement enabled central authorities to benefit from temple economic resources, while avoiding direct confrontation with religious traditions that retained strong popular support. Military organisation within former city-states was systematically dismantled and replaced with provincial units that operated under central command structures rather than local military traditions. Traditional city militias were disbanded or incorporated into royal forces that served kingdom-wide strategic objectives rather than local defensive requirements. Fortification systems that had protected individual cities were either demolished or converted to support royal garrisons that maintained internal security rather than defending against external threats to local communities. Commercial activities underwent significant reorganization as local trade networks were integrated into kingdom-wide commercial systems that prioritized royal economic interests over traditional local commercial relationships. Merchant organizations that had operated under city-state patronage were required to obtain royal licenses and operate according to centralized regulations that standardized commercial practices while ensuring royal participation in profitable trading activities. Traditional commercial law was replaced with royal regulations that reflected central governmental priorities, rather than local commercial customs and practices. The cultural implications of these political transformations extended far beyond immediate administrative changes, fundamentally altering the social and intellectual frameworks that had sustained Sumerian civilization for over 15 centuries. The loss of political independence eliminated the institutional structures that had supported distinctive Sumerian cultural production, while creating new cultural contexts that emphasized integration within broader Mesopotamian civilization rather than maintenance of specifically Sumerian cultural traditions. Artistic production shifted from celebrating local city-state achievements and religious traditions to glorifying royal power and kingdom-wide political accomplishments. Traditional Sumerian artistic motifs were gradually replaced with Babylonian imperial imagery that emphasized royal authority and divine sanction for centralized political control. Local artistic workshops that had produced distinctive regional styles were reorganized to serve royal patrons and produce standardized artistic products that reflected kingdom-wide aesthetic preferences rather than local cultural traditions. Literary production underwent similar transformation as traditional Sumerian epic narratives and religious texts were adapted to serve Babylonian political and cultural objectives. Traditional Sumerian heroes were reinterpreted as early examples of royal virtues that legitimized contemporary Babylonian political authority, while Sumerian religious traditions were incorporated into Babylonian theological systems that emphasized royal divine sanction and centralized religious authority. These literary adaptations preserved essential elements of Sumerian cultural heritage while transforming their political and religious significance to support new governmental structures. The educational transformations that gradually reduced traditional Sumerian scholarly training created an ironic preservation mechanism that would ensure the survival of Sumerian cultural achievements far beyond the political extinction of their creators. As Akkadian and later Babylonian scribes struggled to master the complex administrative and religious texts inherited from Sumerian institutions, they created extensive commentary traditions, bilingual dictionaries, and explanatory materials that preserved Sumerian knowledge in forms accessible to non-native speakers. These scholarly activities initially undertaken for purely practical administrative purposes, established systematic preservation protocols that would maintain Sumerian literary and intellectual traditions for over 2 millennia. The Epic of Gilgamesh exemplifies this preservation process through its complex textual history that spans multiple languages, political systems, and cultural contexts, while maintaining essential narrative elements derived from early Sumerian compositions. The earliest versions, composed in Sumerian during the Ur III period, consisted of separate poems celebrating individual adventures of the legendary king of Uruk. Babylonian scribes during the Old Babylonian period systematically compiled these separate compositions into integrated narrative cycles, while translating them into Akkadian and adding interpretive elements that explained Sumerian cultural concepts for contemporary audiences. The standard version of the epic, compiled during the Neo-Assyrian period by the scholar Sinleki Unini, represents the culmination of this preservation and adaptation process. This version incorporated textual variants from multiple earlier traditions while establishing canonical narrative sequences and thematic interpretations that would influence Near Eastern literature for centuries. The epic's exploration of themes including friendship, mortality, divine justice, and the limits of human achievement resonated across cultural boundaries while preserving specifically Sumerian perspectives on these universal concerns. Archaeological recovery of Gilgamesh tablets from sites throughout the ancient Near East demonstrates the geographical extent of the epic's influence and the systematic nature of its transmission. Copies have been found in locations ranging from Anatolia to Egypt, indicating active scholarly networks that maintained consistent textual traditions across vast distances and multiple political jurisdictions. The standardization of these texts suggests coordinated editorial activities that preserved textual accuracy while enabling local adaptations that made the narrative accessible to diverse cultural audiences. The influence of Gilgamesh on later literary traditions extended far beyond direct textual transmission, establishing narrative conventions and thematic frameworks that would shape storytelling throughout the ancient world. The epic's structure, combining heroic adventure with philosophical reflection, provided models for subsequent literary compositions that explored relationships between human ambition and divine authority. There's a friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu established archetypal patterns for depicting male companionship that would reappear in literary traditions throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Sumerian flood narratives preserved within the Gilgamesh epic and other literary compositions provided source material for flood traditions that appear in multiple Near Eastern cultures and eventually influenced biblical narratives. The Sumerian account describes Utnapishtim's survival of a divine flood sent to destroy humanity, incorporating specific details about ark construction, animal preservation, and divine reconciliation that would reappear in later flood traditions with remarkable consistency. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian sites reveals actual flood deposits that may have provided historical foundations for these literary traditions, suggesting complex relationships between environmental events and mythological narratives. The systematic preservation of Sumerian creation myths through bilingual texts and scholarly commentaries ensured their influence on cosmological thinking throughout the ancient Near East. The Enuma Elish, though composed in Akkadian, incorporates fundamental cosmological concepts derived from earlier Sumerian traditions, including the primordial conflict between order and chaos, the establishment of divine hierarchy through combat, and the creation of humanity to serve divine purposes. These theological frameworks provided intellectual foundations for understanding relationships between divine and human realms that would influence religious thinking throughout Mesopotamian civilization. Sumerian religious practices established institutional precedents and ritual procedures that would shape temple organization and ceremonial activities throughout the ancient Near East for over 2 millennia. The ziggurat architectural form, developed during the early Sumerian period, became the standard design for monumental religious architecture throughout Mesopotamia, while influencing temple construction in regions as distant as Iran and Syria. The stepped pyramid design combined practical functions, including elevated platforms for ritual activities, with symbolic representations of cosmic mountains that connected earthly and divine realms. Temple administrative systems developed by Sumerian institutions established organizational frameworks that would influence religious institutional management throughout the ancient world. The integration of religious ceremonial functions with economic activities including land management, craft production, and commercial operations created institutional models that enabled religious complexes to maintain economic independence while supporting extensive priestly hierarchies and elaborate ritual programs. These administrative innovations provided sustainable financial foundations for religious institutions that would enable their survival through multiple political transformations. Divination practices developed by Sumerian priests established systematic methodologies for interpreting divine will through natural phenomena that would influence religious practices throughout the ancient Near East and beyond. Hepatoscopy, the examination of animal livers for divine messages, required detailed anatomical knowledge and standardized interpretive procedures that enabled consistent divination results across different practitioners and geographical locations. Archaeological recovery of bronze liver models inscribed with interpretive guidelines demonstrates the systematic nature of divination training and the standardization of divinatory knowledge. Astronomical observations conducted by Sumerian temple astronomers provided empirical foundations for mathematical astronomy that would influence scientific development throughout the ancient world. Systematic recording of celestial phenomena, including lunar phases, planetary movements, and stellar positions, generated extensive databases that enabled accurate prediction of astronomical events and precise calendar calculations. These observational records established scientific methodologies that emphasize systematic data collection and mathematical analysis rather than purely mythological interpretations of celestial phenomena. The sexagesimal mathematical system developed by Sumerian mathematicians provided computational frameworks that would influence mathematical development throughout the ancient world while establishing numerical systems that persist in modern usage. The base 60 system proved exceptionally well suited for astronomical calculations, geometric measurements, and commercial transactions due to its numerous divisors that enabled precise fractional calculations using relatively simple arithmetic procedures. Archaeological recovery of mathematical texts demonstrates sophisticated understanding of geometric principles, algebraic relationships, and numerical procedures that exceeded contemporary mathematical knowledge in other ancient civilizations. Sumerian legal traditions established jurisprudential principles and procedural frameworks that would influence law development throughout the ancient Near East, while providing precedents for legal concepts that would eventually influence modern jurisprudence. The emphasis on written law codes that establish consistent legal standards across diverse populations created institutional frameworks for managing complex societies while providing legal protections for individuals regardless of their social status or cultural background. These legal innovations established precedents for systematic jurisprudence that would influence legal development throughout Western civilization. Property law concepts developed within Sumerian legal systems established frameworks for individual ownership, commercial transactions, and inheritance procedures that would provide foundations for commercial law throughout the ancient world. The recognition of individual property rights combined with systematic procedures for property transfer created legal environments that encouraged commercial investment and economic development while providing legal security for agricultural and urban property ownership. These legal frameworks enabled the development of complex commercial relationships that would characterize urban civilizations throughout antiquity. Commercial law innovations, including standardized contracts, partnership agreements, and dispute resolution procedures, established institutional frameworks for long-distance trade that would enable economic integration across vast geographical distances. Sumerian merchants developed systematic procedures for documenting commercial transactions, calculating interest payments, and resolving business disputes that provided legal security for commercial investments while enabling complex trading relationships. These commercial legal frameworks would influence business practices throughout the ancient world while establishing precedents for commercial law that would eventually influence modern business relationships. Family law provisions within Sumerian legal codes addressed marriage contracts, inheritance rights, and child custody arrangements that would influence family legal relationships throughout the ancient Near East while establishing legal protections for women and children that exceeded those available in many contemporary societies. The systematic approach to family legal issues reflected sophisticated understanding of social relationships and individual rights that would provide models for family law development in subsequent civilizations. Urban planning principles developed by Sumerian city planners established organizational frameworks for managing large urban populations while maintaining sanitary conditions and efficient transportation systems. The systematic approach to street layout, drainage systems, residential zoning, and public facility placement created urban environments that could sustain population densities approaching those of modern cities while maintaining living conditions that supported public health and social order. These urban planning innovations would influence city development throughout the ancient world while establishing precedents for systematic urban design that would eventually influence modern city planning. Irrigation engineering techniques developed by Sumerian hydraulic engineers established technological frameworks for large-scale agricultural development that would influence farming practices throughout the ancient world while providing technical foundations for agricultural intensification that would support population growth and urban development. The systematic approach to canal construction, water distribution, and drainage management created agricultural systems that could sustain intensive cultivation while preventing environmental degradation that had limited agricultural productivity in earlier periods. The integration of irrigation systems across multiple political jurisdictions established precedents for interstate cooperation and resource management that would influence international relationships throughout the ancient world. The necessity of coordinating water usage among different communities created diplomatic frameworks and legal procedures for managing shared resources that would provide models for international cooperation in subsequent civilizations. Craft production techniques developed by Sumerian artisans established technological standards and artistic traditions that would influence manufacturing and artistic development throughout the ancient world. The systematic approach to metallurgy, textile production, and ceramic manufacturing created quality standards and production procedures that would provide technological foundations for craft development in subsequent civilizations while establishing artistic traditions that would influence aesthetic development throughout the Near East. The rediscovery of Sumerian civilization during the 19th and 20th centuries fundamentally transformed scholarly understanding of human cultural development, while revealing the antiquity and sophistication of urban civilization in Mesopotamia. Archaeological excavations, beginning with Paul Emile Botter's work at Nineveh in the 1840s and continuing through Leonard Woolley's spectacular discoveries at Ur in the 1920s, systematically revealed material evidence for complex urban societies that predated previously known civilizations by over a millennium. The decipherment of cuneiform script by scholars including Georg Friedrich, Grotefend, Henry Rawlinson, and others during the mid-19th century provided access to tens of thousands of written documents that reveal the complexity and sophistication of Sumerian administrative systems, legal procedures, and intellectual achievements. These textual discoveries demonstrated that Sumerian civilization had achieved levels of governmental organization, commercial sophistication, and intellectual development that rivaled those of much later historical periods. Archaeological evidence for Sumerian technological achievements, including monumental architecture, sophisticated irrigation systems, and advanced metallurgy challenged existing assumptions about the capabilities of ancient societies while revealing the antiquity of technological innovations that had previously been attributed to later civilizations. The discovery of the Standard of Ur, the royal cemetery burials, and the massive ziggurat complexes provided dramatic visual evidence for the wealth, artistic sophistication, and organizational capabilities achieved by Sumerian societies during the 3rd millennium BC. The recognition of Sumerian priority in developing writing systems, urban planning, and complex governmental institutions established new chronological frameworks for understanding human cultural development while revealing the Mesopotamian origins of institutional innovations that had previously been attributed to later civilizations. These discoveries demonstrated that fundamental aspects of human civilization, including cities, writing, law codes, and monumental architecture, had emerged in Mesopotamia centuries or millennia before their appearance in other regions. Modern archaeological techniques, including systematic excavation procedures, scientific dating methods, and interdisciplinary research approaches, have continued to reveal new aspects of Sumerian civilization, while refining understanding of their technological achievements and cultural contributions. Recent discoveries, including extensive urban surveys, environmental reconstructions, and textual analysis, have provided increasingly detailed pictures of Sumerian society, while revealing the complexity and sophistication of their institutional achievements. The study of Sumerian civilization has provided crucial insights into the processes of urban development, state formation, and cultural innovation that have influenced theoretical understanding of human social development, while revealing the antiquity and universality of institutional solutions to the challenges of complex society. The Sumerian experience demonstrates that fundamental aspects of human civilization, including cities, writing, law, and monumental architecture, emerged as systematic responses to practical challenges rather than as unique cultural achievements of particular societies. The legacy of Sumerian civilization extends far beyond its direct historical influence, providing modern societies with evidence for human capabilities in institutional innovation, technological development, and cultural achievement that continues to inspire and inform contemporary efforts to address the challenges of complex society. The Sumerian achievement in creating sustainable urban civilizations that flourished for over 15 centuries while maintaining cultural continuity and institutional effectiveness provides models for contemporary societies seeking to balance technological advancement with cultural preservation and social stability. The preservation of Sumerian cultural achievements through systematic scholarly transmission across multiple civilizations demonstrates the possibility of maintaining intellectual and cultural traditions despite political transformation and social change. The survival of Sumerian literature, legal principles, and technological knowledge through centuries of political upheaval provides evidence for the resilience of human cultural achievements and the importance of institutional frameworks for preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. The Sumerian contribution to world civilization represents humanity's first successful experiment in complex urban society, establishing institutional precedents and cultural traditions that would influence human development for millennia, while demonstrating the remarkable capabilities of human societies to create sustainable solutions to the challenges of civilization. Their achievement stands as testament to human ingenuity, organizational capability, and cultural creativity that continues to inspire and inform human efforts to build just, prosperous, and sustainable societies.